Hey everyone, welcome back. Chapters 851 through 860 of the previous episode. Chun Ping'an subdues his lesser foes and confronts Lake Lord Yin Ho at Verdant Bamboo Lake. Concealing his true power, he shatters the deity's trap and dominates the battle with relentless martial arts strikes. If possible, you can support me via PayPal or become a channel member to help me keep this channel running. Thank you. Now let's get back to the story of Sword of Coming audio series. Chapter 861. Afterward, at the bottom of the lake, it was as if the muffled rumble of winter thunder were rippling through Verdant Bamboo Lake. The lake water churned violently. However, it was as if the huge waves were stopped by a towering city wall when they neared the golden maidservant holding the immortal canopy, with the countless layers of waves shattering apart and transforming into countless beads of chaotic and snow-white water once they slammed into the golden treasure light. Fan Weiran smiled and said, "Let's observe the battle from the shore." The sheet of ice holding the cultivators of the treasure basin immortal realm rose into the sky and rapidly flew toward the dock. Old ancestor Fan Weiran was the paramount leader of the treasure basin immortal realm, so the cultivators standing behind her naturally didn't have any complaints. Only the eccentric second ancestor, the esteemed master of celestial maiden Yan Qing, dared to talk back to old ancestor Fan Weiran. After they arrived near the dock, the sheet of ice silently melted back into the lake, once it lost the support of Fan Weiran's spiritual energy. Following behind their old ancestor, the cultivators of the treasure basin immortal realm gracefully hovered down to the dock that was almost completely in ruins. When these immortals arrived near the dock, Jiu gritted his teeth and dashed over to the bamboo case and the hiking pole, placing his hand on the hilt of his saber as he did so. Fan Weiran simply took a glance at the militarian disciple from the Ghost Axe Palace before brushing past him with the other cultivators. As if sharing a mental link with the old ancestor, the golden maidservant holding the immortal canopy also took a glance at Duyu. Duyu's teeth were chattering, with his body tense as he resolutely remained standing beside the bamboo case and the hiking pole. This was understandable as the tall and sturdy woman was the second most influential cultivator in the dozen or so nations. Moreover, her strength was only very slightly weaker than the city lord of Yellow Axe City, the most influential cultivator in the region. At the same time, Fan Weiran was also renowned for her short temper. She had initially failed to become the leader of the treasure basin immortal realm in the past, and as a result, several cultivators of the immortal sect would die every time she led them on a training journey in the cultivation world. Of course, there were even more martial artists in the cultivation world who were unfortunate enough to suffer her wrath. Fan Weiran was a violent and bloodthirsty person, and she had once traveled to the residence of a 6th-tier martial arts grandmaster who had offended a disciple of the treasure basin immortal realm in the cultivation world. After knocking the martial arts grandmaster to the ground with an immortal treasure, Fan Weiran had stood beside him and stomped on him again and again, making her way from his feet to his head and crushing him into minced meat. Fan Weiran raised a finger and lightly tapped the golden crown on her head, causing all of the golden light to flow back into the crown. The golden maidservant and the immortal canopy in her hand naturally vanished as a result. Yan Qing bowed and said, "Yan Qing pays her respects to old ancestor." There was a kindly expression on Fan Weiran's face as she gently poked Yan Qing in the forehead and said in mock anger, "You're quite courageous, little Yan, actually daring to travel together with this kind of extremely wicked outsider." Yan Qing was embarrassed and speechless as she stood there with her hands in front of her body. Fan Weiran turned around to face Verdant Bamboo Lake, using her mind's voice to tell Yan Qing, "A good show is about to begin. This person has managed to completely destroy Yin Ho's projection and force him to show his true body, so there's no doubt that he's a Vajra body tier martial arts grandmaster. This is indeed quite rare and remarkable." Casting one's gaze over the cultivation world outside the mountains of the dozen or so nations, it's already been 200 years since the last appearance of a legendary Vajra body tier martial artist. Little Yan, you definitely need to be careful when fighting against such a foe. You mustn't let him get close to you, and you shouldn't be too overconfident like Lake Lord Yin Ho, or else you'll suffer as a result. Is it not foolish not to use one's trove of immortal treasures and immortal techniques and rely on one's bare fists alone to have a contest of raw strength with that martial artist? Yan Qing nodded in response. In any case, the Lake Lord has an innately powerful physique, something that chi refiners like us can't hope to match. He's fundamentally a beast after all, so it's only natural that he has very thick and rough skin, Fan Weiran continued. A colossal python measuring 300 meters in length suddenly appeared above the lake, brandishing its 4 claws and rearing its head as it widened its maws and spat a ray of turquoise light at the surface of the lake. The figure in azure raised a palm and surprisingly blocked the formidable ray of light head-on. This was a dazzling scene, and it looked as if a full moon were rising from the lake. Yanqing quietly took in this stunning scene. Fan Weiran snickered and remarked, "A Vajra body tier martial artist engaging in a big battle against the godly body of a lake lord? Not bad at all. This trip has been quite worthwhile." At this moment, 3 water dragons, each measuring more than 100 meters in length, appeared at the 2 river entrances and the 1 canal entrance of the lake. The 2 yellow water dragons were quite large in appearance, while the ink-black water dragon appeared much more slender and graceful. These 3 water dragons were being controlled by the 3 water deities, and only in the eyes of these dragons was there a faint sheen of gold. Not only did 3 water dragons arrive to reinforce Lake Lord Ho, but all of the large and small water veins in the jurisdiction of Verdant Bamboo Lake started to tremble and turn as well, providing their power to Lake Lord Ho and the 3 water deities. It was night at Verdant Bamboo Lake, and only now did colossal waves start to soar into the sky and crash onto the shores. The magnificent battle gradually shifted away from the dock and toward the center of Verdant Bamboo Lake. A female direct disciple of Fan Weiran chuckled softly and said, "Master, this person in azure is quite understanding and tactful, knowing to run further away lest he cause any splash to land on Master." A tall and burly male cultivator concurred with her, saying, "Those who understand the situation are wise people." He's already angered Lake Lord Ho, meaning that his life and death hang in the balance right now. To further anger old ancestor would be to seek certain death. It was as if the gazes of the cultivators from the treasure basin immortal realm were piercing through Du Yu's soul, yet he still remained standing at the forefront of the dock like a wooden post. He appeared even more like a hiking pole than Chan Pingan's verdant green hiking pole. Even celestial maiden Yanqing, someone who was beyond Du Yu's reach, could cause him to suffer greatly, so it went without saying that he would fare much worse against someone like Fan Weiran, a peerless cultivator from the pinnacle of the mountains. If the old woman placed a foot on top of the Ghost Axe Palace, that would truly be a case of the towering mountains bearing down on the immortal force. Fan Weiran turned around and chuckled. "There's no need to feel so tense, little Yen. Feel free to take a step forward." Only after hearing this did Yanqing, who had been observing the rules and regulations regarding seniority and status, take a step forward and stand shoulder to shoulder with old ancestor Fan Weiran. Fan Weiran appeared relaxed as she observed the battle, but her mind was nowhere near as relaxed as her expression let on. Lake Lord Ho's cultivation base was already quite high, but there were still some matters that one would remain oblivious to unless one possessed a high enough position and status. Fan Weiran looked up at the night sky. Only she and City Lord Yihan of Yellow Axe City could see that extremely vague hint of peculiar light in the sky. As a result, Fan Weiran's junior sister was always worried that she would bear ill feelings toward Yanqing, her prized disciple. In fact, she was worried that Fan Weiran might even go as far as to secretly inhibit Yanqing's pursuit of the Great Tao. Because of this, she was always extremely on guard against Fan Weiran as if she were guarding against a thief. Fan Weiran found this slightly laughable. A young girl with an innocent demeanor suddenly said in a soft voice, "Old ancestor, it looks like that person is simply practicing his fist techniques and using those pythons and snakes to temper his physique." Fan Weiran beckoned with her hand, and the young girl skipped over to her side before looking up and saying in an innocent voice, "It's true, old ancestor. I'm not lying to you." The tall and sturdy Fan Weiran bent down slightly, patting the young girl's head and gazing down at her beautiful and glistening eyes. "My little Chui also has extraordinary talent and is quite impressive, so perhaps you'll be just as successful as your Aunt Master Yen when you grow up. When you leave the mountains to train in the cultivation world, you'll be a celestial maiden who attracts the gazes of everyone no matter where you go." Yanqing smiled faintly at the young girl. The young girl glanced at Yanqing before twisting her hands together and lowering her head, saying in embarrassment, "I'm nowhere near as good-looking as Aunt Master Yen." Fan Weiran roared with hearty laughter. This caused the young girl to feel even more embarrassed. Yanqing lightly twisted the young girl's ears. This was a rare display of intimacy from Yanqing. When she finished laughing, Fan Weiran gazed at the distant center of verdant bamboo lake, with a look of killing intent in her eyes as she said in a solemn voice, "In that case, we need to spend some time planning our next move." The decline of an immortal force often started with one generation being inferior to the previous. Yellow Axe City was doing quite well in this regard, as they had He Lu to lead the next generation. However, the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm was doing even better. Apart from Yanqing and Little Cui, there was also Fan Weiran's first disciple, who had already been cultivating in seclusion for 10 years. These 3 young cultivators were the future pillars of the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm. Yanqing's heart shuddered violently. That person had clearly concealed his shortcomings already. An old ancestor Fan Weiran had initially decided to observe the battle from the sidelines, so why was she suddenly developing killing intent now? Above the surface of verdant bamboo lake, a huge python, the true body of Lake Lord Inho, thumped an island with its large tail and created a gigantic ravine. The young man in azure merely launched his fists to push his opponent back. He was more than capable enough to defend himself, but he was definitely quite lacking when it came to offensive abilities. By the looks of it, he was already unable to muster any counterattacks against Lake Lord Inho. After shattering the godly body of the Twilight Cold River's river god and forcing Lake Lord Inho to show his true body, he had seemingly exhausted his power already, and was only able to defend himself but not attack. This caused the initially timid water dragons from the 2 rivers and 1 canal to become increasingly satisfied and ferocious as they fought. Lake Lord Inho's loud bellow traveled over from the distant region of verdant bamboo lake, saying, "Old ancestor Fan, I'm willing to gift the purple Dao robe to the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm, as long as you assist me in killing this ferocious foe." Fan Weiran smiled faintly and didn't say anything. Yanqing looked over, and even though she was already channeling an immortal technique and circulating the spiritual energy in her acupoints, causing a purple glow to appear in her eyes and display the sign of great accomplishment with sun and moon illuminating, eyes producing purple smoke, she was still unable to see the battle in the distance clearly. The battle was taking place too far away from the dock, after all, so she could only see the fierce silhouettes of the lunging pythons and snakes. Even though Little Cui was naturally able to detect some extremely mystical and fuzzy truths, Yanqing still didn't dare to believe what she was hearing. A Vajrabhati tier martial artist from the cultivation world was actually able to withstand the full power attacks of several deities in Lake Lord Inho's territory? Not only that, but he was also able to do so with ease. Yanqing would have found this slightly more believable if the battle were taking place on dry land instead of in verdant bamboo lake, where the water deities naturally enjoyed a huge geographic advantage. In any case, if the true chi of a pure martial artist were depleted, and if they were deprived of the opportunity to quickly replenish their true chi, then it was almost certain that they would face a swift and violent death. However, just how long had the 2 sides been fighting for already? Perhaps Vajrabhati tier martial artists enjoyed more than just a long-lasting breath of true chi, and they also possessed the indomitable Vajrabhatis of the Buddhist sect, a physique that could easily withstand the head-on attacks of the Lake Lord and the 3 water dragons. The dull and thunderous voice of Lake Lord Inho boomed over from the distance again, exclaiming, "Fan Weiran, I'll also gift the position of the Twilight Cold River's river god to the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm. If my old eyes don't deceive me, I remember seeing the Canal Master of Algae Stream die as well?" Fan Weiran replied loudly. Apart from the earth-shattering crashes of the colossal waves, no further response traveled to the dock from the battlefield in the distance. Even though Yanqing didn't pay any heed to mortal matters, she was aware that the only subordinates of verdant bamboo lake were the 3 rivers and 2 canals. With this in mind, handing over the position of a single river god to the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm was already an act of extreme sincerity. If Lake Lord Inho truly handed over the position of Algae Stream's Canal Master as well, taking into account the fact that Peony Stream was essentially neglected and derelict already, then he would genuinely be impaling himself with 2 large and troublesome thorns. If Lake Lord Inho handed over 1 river and 1 canal, giving them the backing of the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm as well, then he would completely lose his power to kill people as he pleased. As such, how could he possibly accept handing over his power just like this? Lake Lord Inho naturally understood the implications, and this matter further pertained to the foundations of his great Tao as well. Even if it were Yanqing in his position, She most definitely wouldn't dare to carelessly give up a significant portion of Verdant Bamboo Lake's water fortune just like this. Old ancestor, are we truly going to ask for 2 deity positions of Verdant Bamboo Lake in a single breath? Yanqing asked using her mind's voice. Fan Weiran smiled faintly and replied, if we don't bump up our asking price like this, Inho will feel extremely resentful afterward even if he's willing to obediently hand over the river god position of the Twilight Cold River. With Inho's shrewdness and abilities, he'll definitely target and suppress the new river god until they become nothing more than a useless deity. However, the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm doesn't have the time and the patience to listen to the complaints of a subordinate river god from a foreign nation. At that time, should we deal with the matter or choose to ignore it? Old ancestor truly has good foresight, Yanqing said with a nod. Fan Weiran grabbed one of Yanqing's smooth and jade-like hands, lightly patting the back of it with her other hand as she remarked with emotion, Little Yen, you don't need to dwell on these mortal matters after hearing about them and understanding them. You should focus on cultivating in peace and nurturing your soul to attain the great Tao. Yanqing nodded in response. Fan Weiran let go of Yanqing's hand and said with confidence, perhaps we'll obtain an even more bountiful yield than I anticipated. Sure enough, less than 10 minutes later, Lake Lord Inho once again bellowed in a loud voice, Old ancestor Fan, I'll give you the position of Algae Stream's Canal Master as well. If you still don't accept this offer and try to ask for more, then this will be the end of the friendship between Verdant Bamboo Lake and the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm. The Lake Lord's voice was no longer as calm and composed as before, and it was clear that he was gritting his teeth in frustration and fury. Fan Weiran smiled faintly and said to Yanqing in a low voice, what do you think? There was a complicated expression on Yanqing's face as she said, be careful, old ancestor. Little Yen, you probably don't know how the final Vajrabhati tier martial artist in the history of the dozen or so nations died, right? You can ask your master when we return to the mountains. That was the battle that allowed my junior sister and the city lord of Yellow Axe City to rise to fame. Fan Weiran laughed loudly as she transformed into a streak of brilliant light that shot toward the center of Verdant Bamboo Lake. Yanqing furrowed her brows. Meanwhile, Du remained obediently standing in the same spot, silently praying to the gods and bodhisattvas in his mind. However, he felt like his prayers would most likely go unanswered when he saw the old ancestor of the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm shoot toward Verdant Bamboo Lake, on a small island that had essentially been flattened. Lake Lord Inho's colossal body slowly slithered around the entire island. The water dragons controlled by the godly bodies of the 2 river gods were brimming with bloodlust as they frenziedly lunged after the young man in azure. As for the ink-black water dragon controlled by the Canal Master of Peony Stream, it was currently floating on the surface of the lake beyond the small island. Meanwhile, the physical body of the Canal Master was hiding in the Dragon Palace and on the brink of collapse as she sat on a straw mat. Her face was as white as a sheet, and she felt like all of the bones in her body had been pulverized to dust. Nearby, the 2 river gods were standing on their respective straw mats with their eyes closed and their minds completely focused. Golden light flowed over their bodies, and water fortune's spiritual energy continued to funnel into their bodies from the Dragon Palace. Even though their physical bodies were here, allowing them to more easily absorb the abundant water fortune of the Dragon Palace, the godly bodies of the 2 river gods and the 1 canal master were completely fused together with the 3 water dragons already. One of the water dragons used its gigantic head to ram the young man in azure. However, Chun Ping'an blocked this attack with a single palm, completely stopping the colossal water dragon in its tracks. He smiled faintly and asked, "Do you feel slightly tired now? Then how about I start to attack instead?" Chun Ping'an retrieved a secret pure jade illumination talisman of the lofty cloud palace, throwing it into the sky after having already silently recited the corresponding mantra in his mind. The talisman glowed with brilliant radiance. It was as if the blazing sun were illuminating the netherworld. Because Chun Ping'an didn't try to target a large area, the offensive power of the talisman targeting the small island became even more formidable. The river god water dragon that had rammed into Chun Ping'an's palm was just about to turn around and retreat. However, as Chun Ping'an took a step forward, his upright palm that was pressing against the head of the water dragon twisted slightly and turned into a hand blade that pushed forward. Slashing down in a straight line, the water dragon that was being controlled by the godly body of a water god was split in half from its head all the way to its tail. When Qian Ping'an stood still again, a slightly bigger golden shard had already appeared in his hand. The physical manifestation of the river god standing on a straw mat in the dragon palace instantly withered away and disintegrated into dust. The other river god water dragon was initially dazed, after which it turned around and furiously fled in panic. However, several cracks appeared on its head as it violently rammed into the blinding curtain of light formed by the pure jade illumination talisman. The water dragon suppressed the agonizing pain and attempted to flee through the ground, thinking that it could flee from this area once it burrowed through the mountain roots of the island and arrived near the lake water. However, its head was struck by a heavy blow the next moment, causing it to slide forward across the ground of the small island and leave a deep ditch in its wake. Qian Ping'an arrived above the head of the river god water dragon and unleashed a downward punch. The entire island shuddered, causing large plumes of dust to rise into the air. At the same time, the violent waves that had initially been slamming into the shore started to surge toward the center of the lake instead. Another golden shard of a deceased river god appeared in Qian Ping'an's hand. Looking up in the next moment, Lake Lord Inho was surprisingly nowhere to be seen. However, this was understandable. Qian Ping'an had been picking the water deities off one by one, so if Lake Lord Inho had chosen to charge into the range of his talisman formation, Qian Ping'an would have unleashed the even more valuable talisman that was on standby inside his sleeve. He would return a serve of the main course to verdant bamboo lake. Qian Ping'an saw out of the corners of his eyes the small and ink-black water dragon, which was floating on the surface of the lake and playing dead, swish its tail and dash into the lake, giving rise to a huge splash. Qian Ping'an patted his sword nurturing gourd, instructing 15th to give chase. He then looked in the direction that Lake Lord Inho had fled. The blade of sword immortal automatically emerged 2 to 3 inches from the scabbard on Qian Ping'an's back. Qian Ping'an narrowed his eyes and looked at the thick sea of clouds continually gathering in the sky above the lake as he commanded in a solemn voice, "Get back inside." Sword immortal returned inside the scabbard with a loud clang. It seemingly felt a little resentful. Qian Ping'an swayed slightly backward as a result, but he temporarily didn't plan to argue with the sword on his back. Qian Ping'an reached forward and grabbed the pure jade illumination talisman. There was one disadvantage with the large majority of immortal talismans, and this was the fact that they were easy to activate but much more difficult to deactivate. Once the talismanic core was activated, one could only watch on helplessly as the spiritual energy of the talisman dispersed into heaven and earth. Cultivators could only slow down the process of the talismanic core breaking apart and the spiritual energy flowing away, but they couldn't completely deactivate the talisman once it was activated. However, the pure jade illumination talisman was good in the sense that it could last for a long time upon being partially deactivated. Even though it had already become something akin to a dilapidated house that leaked wind and rain, it could still presumably last for at least 10 days without any issues. Qian Ping'an naturally had methods to force the Lake Lord of Verdant Bamboo Lake to obediently climb ashore and engage in business with him, but this would take some time. In any case, it was much more likely that the Lake Lord would voluntarily approach the shore to negotiate with him. Evildoers who lived for long and enjoyed lofty positions often weren't stupid. This was a very disappointing realization. As for 15th, it simply trailed behind the canal master of Peony Stream and didn't attempt to kill her. Qian Ping'an would have more leverage in his negotiations with the Lake Lord if he were aware of the approximate location of the Dragon Palace. Qian Ping'an turned around and looked up at the sky, asking with a smile, "Why have you rushed over here, old granny? Are you afraid that I can't swim and won't be able to return to the dock?" Old ancestor Fan Weiran was absolutely fuming right now. Lake Lord Inho had actually run away and was using her to divert this young man's attention. If it weren't for him detecting her imminent arrival, this young man who possessed incredible power definitely wouldn't have stopped attacking and abandoned his pursuit of Lake Lord Inho. Just then, Lake Lord Inho had still dared to talk about the friendship between Verdant Bamboo Lake and the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm. In the next 100 years, old ancestor Fan Weiran wanted to see whether Verdant Bamboo Lake ran deeper, or whether the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm possessed loftier immortal techniques. Her junior sister was coincidentally unable to advance to the next cultivation tier anymore, so she could lead some disciples here to have a standoff with these lowly beasts and spirits of Verdant Bamboo Lake for the next 100 years. She looked at the young man who was speaking politely, yet his hand was hidden inside his sleeve and pinching the talisman that was exuding a terrifying might. A small hint of its golden glow was also clearly visible. Fan Weiran came to a hovering stop above the shore of the small island, glancing at the vermilion gourd hanging by the waist of the young man as she said with a faint smile, "Sure enough, you really are a sword immortal. Not only that, but you're quite young as well. This is truly very astonishing." Qian Ping'an grabbed his sword nurturing gourd and took a swig of water, after which he wiped his mouth with his hand and chuckled. "That brother Duyu of mine told me about bucket loads of evil deeds committed by Verdant Bamboo Lake while we were making our way over here, but he displayed sincere admiration whenever he mentioned the treasure basin immortal realm. With this in mind, I won't blame old Granny for your actions tonight. Otherwise, observing such an entertaining show requires some payment." Fan Weiran chuckled coldly in her mind. However, she suddenly noticed the young man staring intently at her, and he said in a slow voice, "So please piss off now." Fan Weiran's expression became dark, with her sleeves suddenly bulging and billowing loudly in the wind. However, she immediately smiled and said, "There's much time in the future, so here's wishing young sword immortal a smooth and safe journey through the region. If you wish, you can visit the treasure basin immortal realm as a guest as well." Qian Ping'an asked an extremely strange question, inquiring, "Is your ancestral hall very sturdy?" Fan Weiran was able to tell that this wasn't a good-intentioned question, but since she had already made up her mind, she didn't hesitate any further as she replied with a faint smile, "You'll know when you see it in the future, young sword immortal." She then flew back to the dock. Qian Ping'an glanced up at the pitch-black sea of clouds that was yet to dissipate. Apart from the attacks from Lake Lord Inho's true body, which had felt relatively acceptable, the weak attacks from the 3 remaining water dragons had genuinely been unable to temper and improve his physique. Qian Ping'an put away his sword nurturing gourd and stood there for a moment longer before tapping his foot and dashing away from the small island. He sprinted across the surface of Verdant Bamboo Lake, transforming into a streak of azure smoke as he lightly trod on the water and made his way to the dock. When Qian Ping'an jumped onto the dock, he saw that old ancestor Fan Weiran and the cultivators of the treasure basin immortal realm had already taken their leave. Only Duyu remained standing there suited in his divine dew-bearing armor, holding the hilt of his saber in one hand as he acted as a door god for Qian Ping'an's bamboo case, bamboo hat, and hiking pole. "You're showing this much faith and loyalty?" Qian Ping'an commented with a smile. Duyu furiously wiped his face with his hand. His face felt slightly stiff because of the wind and rain, but he immediately rubbed his hands together and put on a dazzling smile after he wiped his face and relaxed his muscles. He did indeed want to speak obsequiously and praise Qian Ping'an, but he was unable to think of a praise befitting of the situation no matter how hard he racked his brain. He felt like the words of praise in his mind were all unworthy of this mighty senior's peerless aura and might. Qian Ping'an gently unrolled and flattened his rolled-up sleeve, following which he put on his bamboo hat, slung the bamboo case on his back, and pulled the hiking pole out from the dock. Duyu was just about to move, but he quickly realized that his legs were bloody numb as well. He had worked diligently as a small door god from the Ghost Axe Palace, so he should at least be commended for his hard work even if he weren't commended for his merit, right? "Mighty senior, you're an old immortal from the pinnacle of the mountains with an extremely astute gaze, so you definitely have to vaguely remember what I've done for you tonight." Qian Ping'an walked away from the dock, and Duyu hurriedly deactivated his divine dew-bearing armor, and had it transform back into a militarian armor pellet which he put inside his sleeve. His footsteps were nimble and swift like the wind as he caught up to Qian Ping'an and asked in a quiet voice, "Senior, what should we do now that we've successfully pushed back the numerous water deities of Verdant Bamboo Lake and shooed away the group of cultivators from the treasure basin immortal realm? Should we target the temples of the 2 river gods, or should we head over to Imperial Accompanying City to fight for the valuable treasure?" Qian Ping'an asked with a smile. As for the accuracy of saying that he had pushed back the numerous water deities, Qian Ping'an couldn't be bothered correcting Duyu and explaining these matters to him. Duyu chuckled and didn't appear troubled or embarrassed at all. However, it was still necessary to maintain a balance and not take things too far, so Duyu didn't waffle on about anything else afterward. Even so, Duyu couldn't help but ask after walking for a while, "Senior, are we making our way to the water goddess shrine of Algae Stream's Canal Master?" Chen Ping'an nodded and replied, I plan to rest there for a few days and wait for the Lake Lord to come ashore to discuss business with me. Du nodded in response and didn't dare to ask any further questions. After returning to the water goddess shrine, they saw that everyone had already fled following the death of Algae Stream's canal master. Regardless of whether they were ghosts or living humans, not a single one of the canal master's subordinates or maidservants remained in the shrine. Chen Ping'an arrived in front of the internal residence with the golden plaque reading, Flowing rivers never dry, hanging above the door, and he placed the golden plaque inside his minimization treasure. Even though the canal master of Algae Stream was already dead, this unique plaque had still produced some water fortune spiritual energy, and was very likely the most valuable item in the entire shrine. Chen Ping'an took off his bamboo hat and bamboo bookcase and sat on the bottommost step, after which he instructed Du to start a campfire in the courtyard. Chen Ping'an started to practice standing meditation. It was necessary to rest and recuperate after intense battles, or else it would be a long-term hidden danger if he suffered any lingering side effects. In addition, Chen Ping'an also needed to use an internal observation technique to see whether the water fortune golden python and the water fortune turquoise snake, both of which he hadn't fully performed initial refinement on, could truly benefit his water palace. Du sat cross-legged beside the campfire and carefully stole a glance at the mighty senior's sitting posture. He didn't have many thoughts, and he simply felt like the cultivation of immortal techniques wasn't simply about assuming the correct form. In any case, he surmised that this was definitely an extremely profound cultivation technique taking into account the mighty senior's lofty status. This was definitely a cultivation technique that he wouldn't be able to master even if the mighty senior patiently taught it to him. A streak of brilliant light sliced through the night sky and disappeared into the mighty senior's wine gourd. Du silently told himself that all of these strange and wonderful things weren't odd at all. Approximately 2 hours passed, and Du continued to add dry branches to the campfire the entire time. After a while, Du noticed the mighty senior opening his eyes with a slight smile on his face. He appeared to be in a fairly good mood. Chen Ping'an raised his head and glanced up. The thick sea of clouds that had enveloped almost the entire area above Verdant Bamboo Lake had already dispersed. There was a round moon in the sky. The traditions and customs of Verdant Bamboo Lake have already been this way for 1,000 years, so do you think it's impossible for anyone to change it? Chen Ping'an asked. It will be impossible unless everyone from the top to the bottom is replaced, Du replied boldly. From the Lake Lord to the water deities of the 3 rivers and the 2 canals, everyone needs to go. In fact, the Lake Lord of Verdant Bamboo Lake needs to be the first to go, and only then will there be any chance of implementing change. However, trying to achieve such a great feat is impossible unless it's personally carried out by someone like Senior, a cultivator from the pinnacle of the mountains. Afterward, the powerful cultivator will need to waste dozens of years of their life to keep a close eye on the area. If this can't be done, however, then not replacing the deities at all will be the better option, in my opinion. Truth be told, Lake Lord Ho of Verdant Bamboo Lake is a powerful ruler who isn't too cruel to his subjects. He did purposely cause some floods and droughts, but those were simply in order to obtain some beautiful maidservants for his dragon palace. Of course, several hundred commoners would die each time as a result. However, this is already better than some mentally challenged deities who can't even control the power of their own mystical abilities. With a whoosh, these reckless deities will easily kill thousands upon thousands of people. If they're a bit more short-tempered and always pick fights with other deities or offend other deities, then those in their jurisdiction will truly be subject to endless hardships and suffering. I've traveled around the cultivation world for many years, and I've come across many mountain gods, river gods, city gods, and mountain lords who only focus on the major matters and largely ignore the minor matters. They care nothing about mortal commoners, and they focus on building relationships with official immortals in the mountains, martial arts grandmasters with their own forces, the relatives of officials in the capital, scholars with good potential, and so on. Chen Ping'an took a glance at Du. There was an innocent expression on Du's face as he said, I'm just telling the truth, Senior, and it's not me doing these bad things. To say something unpleasant, the bad deeds that I've committed in the cultivation world are nothing compared to the sinister deeds committed by the Lake Lord of Verdant Bamboo Lake and the Canal Master of Algae Stream. It's nothing but a drop in the ocean. I'm aware that Senior dislikes the cold-hearted nature of our immortal forces, But I'm speaking nothing but the sincere truth in front of Senior. I don't dare to utter a single lie. Chen Ping'an smiled and didn't say anything. You didn't push his luck? Understanding that he wasn't truly fancied by this old immortal from the pinnacle of the mountains. He knew that he couldn't borrow this powerful Senior's domineering might to harass other people. At most, the mighty Senior wouldn't kill him with a single flick of his sleeve. You was smart enough to understand this much. Perhaps this was the true nature of someone from the pinnacle of the mountains. Perhaps this was the true meaning of the great Tao being heartless. In reality, Jiu had also felt slightly melancholy when gazing up at the moon just then. He had traveled through the cultivation world so many times already, but for some unknown reason, today was the first time in many years that he missed his parents. However, he immediately became alert and focused after Chen Ping'an opened his eyes, carefully responding to the mighty Senior's seemingly casual questions. He simply treated this as a form of tempering his mind. His parents had always said that tempering the mind wasn't especially important, and the teachings of the ancestors in the immortal force and the repetitive nagging of the Tao mentors to their disciples were nothing more than superficial remarks. In actual fact, immortal coins, immortal treasures, and immortal techniques pertaining to the foundations of one's great Tao were the three most important things. Of course, it was still necessary to somewhat cultivate the mind. Jiu mustered his courage and asked, "Senior, how did the battle on Verdant Bamboo Lake go?" Chen Ping'an smiled and replied, "Just like you said, I simply pushed the water deities back. We need to make money in a peaceful and harmonious manner after all." Jiu had a nagging feeling that this wasn't the case. However, he didn't have the courage to delve any further. He had used almost all of his future courage in a single night. What more could he possibly do at this moment? Afterward, Chen Ping'an started to focus on practicing standing meditation. Meanwhile, Jiu used the Ghost Axe Palace's secret mantra to slowly enter a meditative state and practice a breathing technique. Dawn arrived. Chen Ping'an stood up and started to practice walking meditation, and he said to Jiu, who had hurriedly stood up alongside him, "Look around this water goddess shrine and see if you can find any valuable treasures." Jiu nodded in response and was just about to try his luck, seeing if he could find for this mighty Senior an immortal tool or a few lesser heat coins. However, Chen Ping'an suddenly added, "By valuable treasure, what I mean is anything worth a single snowflake coin." Jiu faltered upon hearing this, thinking that he must have misheard the mighty Senior's words. "Senior, did you mean to say one lesser heat coin?" he asked in a careful voice. "With such poor hearing, it's truly a wonder how you've managed to survive in the cultivation world until now," Chen Ping'an remarked in exasperation. Jiu immediately came to his senses, and he started to scour the entire shrine for anything of value. With the mighty Senior standing beside him, he would even dare to dig up the Dragon Palace at the bottom of Verdant Bamboo Lake, to say nothing of an ownerless shrine of a canal master. Chen Ping'an closed his eyes and continued to practice walking meditation. Only when noon arrived did Jiu return to the courtyard with 2 large sacks. He had returned with a bountiful yield. "I'll take the more valuable sack and you can keep the other one," Chen Ping'an said. "Did I do something wrong, Senior?" Jiu asked with an anxious expression. Chen Ping'an continued to practice walking meditation as he replied in a slow voice, "There are rules when it comes to cultivation, there are rules when it comes to traveling through the cultivation world, and there are also rules when it comes to making transactions. Do you understand this?" Jiu didn't actually understand, but he pretended that he did. In any case, he nervously accepted the sack of less valuable treasure according to Chen Ping'an's instructions. After thinking for a moment, Jiu opened the 2 sacks and transferred a few of the most valuable items from his sack to the mighty Senior's sack. Chen Ping'an didn't stop him. He stopped practicing walking meditation and leaped onto the roof ridge of the tallest building in the shrine, gazing toward the distant imperial accompanying city. Afterward, Chen Ping'an started to walk along the numerous roof ridges as he practiced walking meditation. Jiu couldn't help but feel puzzled. Why did it look like the mighty Senior was practicing a martial arts fist stance of the cultivation world instead of some immortal technique? However, he immediately felt a strong sense of admiration. Sure enough, this mighty Senior was different from the others and had already returned to a state of natural simplicity. Evening arrived, and Jiu started another campfire in the courtyard. "All right, you can continue to travel through the cultivation world now," Chen Ping'an said. You've stayed in the shrine for 1 day and 1 night already, so all of the people observing you are well aware of the situation by now. Do you felt slightly awkward? Sure enough, his subtle tricks were unable to escape this mighty senior's detection. However, if the two of them had immediately parted ways at the dock, Du was worried that he wouldn't have been able to make it to Imperial accompanying city alive. Du thought for a moment and felt like he should stop before he pushed his luck too far. With this in mind, he grabbed the less valuable sack of treasures and was just about to make his way to Imperial accompanying city. However, Chen Ping'an suddenly called him back and said, "Wait for a moment longer." Du obeyed Chen Ping'an's instructions and put down the hemp sack, sitting cross-legged on the ground, and said in a quiet voice, "Senior, I actually know another secret talisman from the ancestral hall of my immortal sect, one that's not much inferior to the snow soil talisman and the steel-carrying talisman." Chen Ping'an smiled and shook his hand, saying, "You were facing a life-and-death situation just then, so it was understandable that you did something so immoral. However, now that you aren't facing life-and-death danger anymore, trying to break the rules of your immortal force to gild the lily isn't very good. When walking along the path of cultivation, one should learn to become a proper person before becoming an immortal." Du faltered upon hearing this. He glanced at the hemp sack on the ground. It was as if he were finally able to grasp some vague clues at this moment. Du silently clenched his hands into fists. Chen Ping'an stood up, and Du was subconsciously about to stand up as well. However, Chen Ping'an gestured to him to remain seated. Du turned around, and he saw a familiar figure barge into his field of view a brief moment later. She was genuinely beautiful no matter how he looked at her. This was as expected of celestial maiden Yanqing. Chen Ping'an furrowed his brows. Du was feeling slightly fearful, and he prayed in his mind that the mighty old immortal wouldn't ruthlessly crush this beautiful flower. Perhaps the mighty senior wouldn't care about such a beautiful celestial maiden being killed. But Du would definitely feel pained. You already managed to kill the 2 river gods and the 1 canal master in quick succession, so why did you purposely allow Lake Lord Inho to flee? Yanqing asked. Du almost fell over, and he hurriedly placed his hands on the ground to support himself. "Who gave you the courage to seek me out again and again?" Chen Ping'an asked. Yanqing smiled faintly and replied, "You're a sword immortal who's worried about the sea of clouds bearing down and bringing harm to the innocent commoners. So are you truly someone who will mercilessly kill others for no reason? I refuse to believe this. What does it matter to me whether you believe me or not? Let me say this one more time. My patience is limited," Chen Ping'an retorted. Yanqing directly walked toward the campfire. Du had already shifted his position slightly, allowing him to both observe the changing expressions of the mighty senior, as well as appreciate the graceful beauty of the celestial maiden standing under the moon. However, Du's jaw slowly dropped open. A streak of azure dashed toward the celestial maiden in white, who was able to compete with the moon's radiance. Afterward, Yanqing was lifted into the air, as if she were a small chick, and carried onto a rooftop. The mighty senior stood on the roof ridge and spun in a circle, causing the beautiful young woman to spin in an even larger circle. There was a loud whoosh. Yanqing was launched into the distance and disappeared from view. Chen Ping'an jumped down from the roof ridge and walked back to the steps to sit down. Du gulped and wiped his mouth with his hand. Chen Ping'an waved a hand and said, "You can leave now." Du was just about to respectfully bid farewell. However, an annoyed and slightly regretful expression suddenly appeared on the mighty senior's face, after which he shot into the air and caused a huge tremor to ripple through the shrine, similar to what he had caused at the dock of verdant bamboo lake. Du felt slightly hesitant. Should he leave or should he stay? He hadn't bid farewell yet, so leaving just like this felt quite disrespectful. If he didn't leave, however, what if the mighty senior suddenly started to cherish the beautiful celestial maiden? What if he returned with the soft and lithe celestial maiden Yanqing to enjoy some intimacy here? The moon was beautiful, and the celestial maiden was even more breathtaking. Du immediately slapped himself in the face. He slung the hemp sack on his back and quickly took his leave. However, he felt slightly dazed after he made his way out of the water goddess shrine. The mighty senior had hurriedly rushed away for some unknown reason just then, but perhaps this was the only time that he had truly unleashed his full strength. He had charged from the water goddess shrine back to verdant bamboo lake. His azure figure had already vanished from sight, but the thunderous booms triggered by his immense speed still rumbled through the sky. Du heaved a heavy sigh. Meanwhile, Chen Ping'an stood on the dock and narrowed his eyes. The annoying young celestial maiden from the treasure basin immortal realm had been tossed into verdant bamboo lake by his big throw just then, but she wouldn't suffer any injuries and would at most experience some suffocation for a brief moment. She would only be slightly disheveled. When Chen Ping'an realized that the Lake Lord of Verdant Bamboo Lake would very likely be nearby, however, he had no option but to rush over to check on the situation. Sure enough, Yanqing disappeared without a trace after crashing into the lake. Chen Ping'an retrieved the pure jade illumination talisman using his index finger and his middle finger. Just as he was about to unleash the talisman between his fingertips, Lake Lord Ho, who was wearing the reddish-purple dragon robe, broke through the surface of the lake and walked out. Standing beside him was Yanqing, the young female cultivator who had seemingly just been released from an immortal restriction, and she had a furious expression as she glared intensely at Chen Ping'an. Lake Lord Ho gestured with a hand and explained with a faint smile, "I was worried about Celestial Maiden Yanqing's safety just then, so I activated a minor immortal technique upon seeing the critical nature of the situation, trying to reduce the momentum of Celestial Maiden Yanqing's fall as she crashed into the lake. Please forgive me if I've caused any offense, and please feel free to return to shore. Celestial Maiden Yanqing." Yanqing's expression was ice-cold as she expelled the remaining moisture from her body and flew back to the dock. Yanqing was unable to imagine what would have happened if the main culprit behind her predicament hadn't rushed over to the dock. Chen Ping'an glanced at her and asked, "You're not going to leave yet? I can't help you anymore if you enjoyed the tea of Algae Stream's Canal Master, but I can indeed help you if you enjoy the taste of Verdant Bamboo Lake's lake water." Yanqing humped coldly before soaring away on the wind. Chen Ping'an looked at the guarded expression of Lake Lord Ho and chuckled. "You should be keenly aware of the fact that I could kill you with relative ease if I were hellbent on doing so." Ho nodded and replied, "This is indeed the case, so I'm actually very curious about why Sword Immortal is choosing to spare me." Chen Ping'an looked around and didn't say anything. Lake Lord Ho's feet remained in the water the entire time. Not only that, but a sea of dark clouds started to gather above the jurisdiction of Verdant Bamboo Lake again. What actually happened with the secret letter that the prefectural overseer of Imperial Accompanying City sent to the capital back then? Chen Ping'an asked. Lake Lord Ho didn't hesitate in the least as he replied, "The contents of the letter aren't anything new, and I presume that Sword Immortal is able to guess what the prefectural overseer wrote." He naturally expressed hope that his good friend in the capital could help him continue to investigate the case and eventually overturn the verdict following his death. At the very least, his good friend should find an opportunity to publicize the truth regarding the case. However, there was one remark in the letter that Sword Immortal probably hasn't been able to guess. At the end of the letter, the prefectural overseer said that his friend didn't need to rush and endanger himself by investigating the matter if he were unable to become a high-ranking official of the Immortal Court, lest he fail to overturn the verdict and become another victim. Chen Ping'an grabbed a pot of wine from thin air, cracking open the clay seal and starting to drink slowly. Lake Lord Ho continued his explanation, saying with a smile, "I have some networks in the capital, and Sword Immortal is also aware of my terrible relationship with Imperial Accompanying City. As such, I hadn't been harboring any ulterior motives when I instructed the Canal Master of Algae Stream to follow the messenger, and I had simply wanted the secret letter to be successfully delivered to the capital. Moreover, I also have some subordinates in good relationships in the capital, so I told the Canal Master to help the prefectural overseer's good friend enjoy a smoother journey through the Imperial Court as long as he was willing to investigate the case and overturn the verdict. However, I hadn't anticipated that the city god of Imperial Accompanying City would be so resolute, directly killing an official of the Imperial Court, someone who was already a prefectural overseer. Not only that, but the city god hadn't shown any patience at all, not even waiting for the prefectural overseer to leave Imperial Accompanying City before he killed him. This was actually quite troublesome, and the city god was presumably acting out of desperation, having no time to care about anything else and simply trying to eliminate the root of the problem first. Afterward, word somehow got out that the Canal Master of Algae Stream was in the capital, and this caused the city god of Imperial Accompanying City to start scheming as well. He instructed a trusted subordinate to take the half-formed incense person and bring it to the capital to deliver to the prefectural overseer's good friend. The hand-picked scholar was yet to fill a vacant spot in the imperial court at the time, so he had agreed to the conditions of imperial accompanying city god temple without any hesitation. This being the case, I had instructed the canal master of Algae Stream to return to verdant Bamboo Lake. After all, better a close neighbor than a distant brother. Making some small and subtle moves behind the scenes would be fine, but doing away with all pretenses of geniality would be going too far. Qian Ping'an suddenly asked a seemingly unrelated question, saying, "With your position as Lake Lord, do you need to go to so much trouble to obtain a talented mortal woman whom you fancy?" Lake Lord Inho smiled faintly and replied, "First of all, the commoners are naive, and they fear might rather than virtue. Second of all, it isn't my dragon palace that requires beautiful maidservants. Thirdly, the 3 rivers and 2 canals also need maidservants, as do my subordinates. Of course, if one woman disappears today, another disappears tomorrow, and so on, then the excessive fear sown in the territory of verdant Bamboo Lake will also be a bad thing. The commoners are easy to deal with, and they'll have no option but to accept their fate. However, the scholarly clans and the wealthy clans are different, and these are clans that can grow legs and relocate. Word will get out, so what will these clans do once they're subject to perpetual fear all year round? They'll naturally relocate away from the region. As time goes on, the feng shui and fortune of verdant Bamboo Lake will continue to flow away year after year. However, verdant Bamboo Lake establishing a rule that both parties are clearly aware of will go a long way to easing everyone's fears. In addition, the Dragon Palace also compensates the relevant families handsomely. So to be truthful with Sword Immortal, many wealthy families yearn for their daughters and granddaughters to catch the attention of the Dragon Palace. The Lake Lord paused for a moment before saying with a sigh, "The best transactions in the world are never those that allow one to gain explosive wealth overnight. Rather, they're the ones that allow people to enjoy a slow but steady stream of income. What does Sword Immortal think?" Qian Ping'an wiped the corner of his mouth with his thumb and replied with a faint smile, "This is a very good principle, but why does it sound different coming from Lake Lord's mouth?" Lake Lord Inho smiled and didn't say anything. He was waiting for the young Sword Immortal to name his price. No matter how much the Lake Lord detested this person, he and his Dragon Palace could only suffer in silence since he was weaker and unable to stop this person from doing as he pleased on verdant Bamboo Lake. He needed to cut his losses. This would be much better than doubling down and making even more mistakes. By cutting his losses, he could at least keep his life and keep his force, allowing him to maintain hope. On the other hand, doubling down and making even more mistakes would exhaust all of his power and resources, and potentially leading to the spectacular collapse of his powerful force. Qian Ping'an put the pot of wine in his minimization treasure and asked, "And regarding the decaying of the city god's godly body in imperial accompanying city?" Lake Lord Inho was extremely honest with his visitor tonight, and he couldn't conceal his feeling of schadenfreude as he recalled this matter. He smiled and replied, "Not only did the scholar who became a prefectural overseer exceed everyone's expectations and obtain a portion of the prefectural city's fortune and the Silver Screen Nation's scholarly fortune very early on, but the portion that he received also far exceeded the expectations of imperial accompanying city and me. In reality, however, this made sense. Otherwise, how could he have relied on himself to flee from imperial accompanying city when he was still little? In addition to this, there was also a karmic tie between him and a princess of the Silver Screen Nation at the time, with the princess falling in love with him at first sight and not being able to forget him no matter what. She even went as far as to become a Taoist nun who guarded the oil lamps in the temple to escape arranged marriage, and even though she possessed no cultivation aptitude, she was ultimately a princess who was deeply adored by the emperor. As a result, she inadvertently caused a wisp of the nation's fortune to tie itself to the prefectural overseer. When this princess received the nightmarish news of his death in the capital's Taoist temple, she resolutely used a golden hairpin to stab herself in the neck and commit suicide. With these 2 deaths stacking together, the gravity of the sins committed by the city god of imperial accompanying city meant that an irreparable fracture appeared on his godly body. This is a deadly fracture that can't even be repaired using hidden virtue. Qian Ping'an asked one final question, saying, "What fate might imperial accompanying city suffer?" Inho glanced toward imperial accompanying city and shook his head, saying, It will be a very tragic fate. To come across a city god who's hoping to spread his karmic fate to every single resident in the prefecture, and have them face the heavenly tribulation with him. It can be said that the ancestors of these people haven't accumulated enough virtue. A heavenly tribulation will descend shortly, and at the very least, all of the mortals in Imperial accompanying city will be killed as a result. Because of this, all of the Qi refiners who entered Imperial accompanying city earlier will leave before the heavenly tribulation descends. They won't dare to linger even if they're unable to obtain the valuable treasure. Lake Lord Ho initially thought that he would still need to negotiate with Qian Ping'an tonight, but to his surprise, the young sword immortal in azure immediately turned around to leave. This caused the Lake Lord to feel uneasy, but he didn't dare to head ashore to pursue the young man. In the end, he could only suppress his resentment, hatred, and unease as he channeled a mystical ability and returned to his dragon palace at the bottom of the lake. Qian Ping'an returned to the water goddess shrine of Algae Stream's canal master. However, he discovered that not only had Du returned, but even Yanqing was present as well. Qian Ping'an didn't say anything this time, and he walked over to the campfire and squatted down, extending his hands forward to warm them up. Du squatted down beside him and said, "I saw Celestial Maiden Yanqing return here just then, and upon recalling that Senior's sack of valuable treasures was still sitting here unguarded, I couldn't help but hurry back here in anxiousness." After entering the shrine, Yanqing had stood on the steps the entire time and observed the cultivator from the Ghost Axe Palace. She hadn't had much of an impression of Du in the past, and she had only heard about him once or twice because his parents were immortal Dao partners from the mountains. She only knew that he was a person who bullied the weak and feared the strong, liking to seek entertainment as he wandered around the cultivation world. "I'm only here to ask about a single principle, and I'll take my leave after asking this question," Yanqing said. However, Qian Ping'an remained adrift and silent as he stared intently at the campfire. Yanqing fell silent for a moment before asking, "Why did you attack He Lu? Perhaps you heard about some of the sinister deeds committed by Verdant Bamboo Lake from Du, so it's understandable that you acted the way you did against them. However, you shouldn't have met He Lu before." Du rolled his eyes and made a face. "Would you just look at this?" She had actually come here to seek justice for her pretty boy lover. She deserved the fate of being tossed into Verdant Bamboo Lake by the mighty senior. Yanqing was already mentally prepared for this person to play blind and deaf. To her surprise, however, Qian Ping'an said slowly, "He Lu's first words of dissuasion hadn't been for my sake, but instead for the sake of Algae Stream's canal master who had treated you to some tea." Yanqing wasn't stupid, and she was naturally aware of this matter. This was because He Lu felt at the time that I was a cultivator who possessed an even higher cultivation base than the canal master of Algae Stream, Qian Ping'an continued. Yanqing wanted to listen some more, so she hesitated for a moment before planning to sit down at the top of the steps. However, the sword immortal in azure immediately shot her a sideways glance. Yanqing immediately stopped moving upon seeing the fear-inducing look in Qian Ping'an's eyes. The sword immortal in azure suddenly retracted his gaze and continued to stare intently at the campfire, once again falling silent. It was clear that he hadn't finished speaking yet, but it didn't look like he was in the mood to continue saying anything. Yanqing felt increasingly embarrassed and angry. Was she so unworthy that he couldn't even be bothered saying a few more words? Her heartstrings shuddered, and she didn't hesitate anymore as she rapidly leaped into the air and soared away on the wind. Du hesitated for a moment before also standing up to take his leave. Qian Ping'an nodded in acknowledgement. He continued to stare at the campfire. Reason wasn't solely held by powerful individuals, nor was it solely held by weak individuals. A person wouldn't be more reasonable because they were stronger, nor would a person be less reasonable because they were weaker. However, this seemed to be a principle unique to Qian Ping'an. It wasn't Du's, it wasn't Celestial Maiden Yanqing's, nor was it the prodigious He Lu's. The cultivation world of the water-combing nation still had Song Yushao. The foul and chaotic Bamboo Scroll Lake still had the entity general who had been willing to slay his maddened subordinates. The ghost and skeleton-ridden malicious Ghost Valley still had sword cultivator Pu Rang and sect leader Zhu Quan. Here at the Silver Screen Nation and Verdant Bamboo Lake, however, there was not a single person of note. It was upon thinking of this that Qian Ping'an had fallen silent. Chen Ping'an knew why this simple principle didn't resonate with Du Yu, Yanqing, He Lu, and the others. This was because such a principle wouldn't bring them any benefits at all. On the contrary, it would make them feel bogged down as they traveled on the path of cultivation, feeling like they couldn't conduct themselves and deal with matters in a satisfying manner. In this sense, it wasn't necessarily the case that they didn't understand the simple principle, but rather that they pretended not to understand even though they actually understood. The Great Tao was distant and lofty, after all, and the scenery at those immense heights was far too attractive. In contrast, the mortal world was lowly and filled with mud, and the myriad of emotions that played out here were completely trivial in their eyes. Indeed, it wasn't always good to understand and investigate matters that were unrelated to oneself. For example, Chen Ping'an didn't need to ask Lake Lord Ho why the imperial court of the Silver Screen Nation didn't evacuate the residents of Imperial Accompanying City. This was naturally because the karmic fate would remain even if the residents fled from the city. Because of this, the Emperor of the Silver Screen Nation would choose to remain silent even if he were fully aware of the peculiar phenomenon surrounding Imperial Accompanying City as well as the reason behind it. Rather than having the fleeing residents of Imperial Accompanying City disturbing the feng shui and fortune of other prefectures and thus affecting the fortune of the entire nation, it was better for everything to be cleanly ended at Imperial Accompanying City. This was the reason why the officials and wealthy clans in Imperial Accompanying City were still oblivious to the impending doom hanging above their heads, and why there were still profligate youths boisterously charging out of the city to hunt and entertain themselves. When morning arrived, there would be the sound of ox-drawn carriages trundling into the city with full loads of firewood. When the moon shone at night, there would also be the sound of textiles being flattened. Cultivators distanced themselves from the mortal world and mortal matters, and there were good reasons as to why this was the case. Chen Ping'an remained squatting on the ground as he thought about many matters. The campfire had already died out, yet his hands were still held out as if he were warming them up. He stayed in the same position all the way until morning. Chen Ping'an stood up and placed the hemp sack inside his minimization treasure, after which he put on his bamboo hat and his bamboo case and grabbed his hiking pole. He made his way to Imperial Accompanying City. He didn't visit the city god temple first, nor did he visit the fire god shrine. Instead, he decided to visit a ghost residence that had already been abandoned for many years. Afterward, there would be some things that he needed to do. Under the cover of night, a young man in azure jumped over the city walls and entered Imperial Accompanying City. There was a night curfew in the city, and Chen Ping'an traveled by himself to the ghost residence. He had asked about this place when talking to the shopkeepers of the incense shops before. It was dark and quiet as Chen Ping'an stood outside the entrance by himself. He looked at the severely rotten courtyard gates, and there was already no door god or spring couplet to be seen. Even until death, the scholar-turned-prefectural overseer had still been unable to win justice and exact revenge for his parents. Then what about clay vase Alice Chen Ping'an? The young man who no longer wore straw sandals and no longer needed to enter the mountains to gather medicinal herbs took off his bamboo hat. There were qi refiners from various regions and forces hiding or staying near the ghost residence. They had already been here for a long time. At this moment, however, even the slowest and weakest qi refiners among them felt startled, with a sudden and mysterious sense of panic washing over their minds. An old man with a small monkey on his shoulder frowned deeply as he stood on a distant roof ridge. He had surprisingly made an incorrect observation at the city gates before, and had completely failed to see through this young man's cultivation base. The old man raised a hand and gently held his irritated pet down. As for the useless pieces of trash who were already feeling stifled and unable to channel their spiritual energy properly for no apparent reason, they naturally didn't dare to venture out to see which mighty being had appeared in the area. When the young man took off his bamboo hat and bamboo case and had them vanish into thin air, the old man started to walk back in retreat. On the wide street and outside the entrance of the rundown ghost residence, the azure sleeves of the young man billowed even though there was no wind. His body instantly vanished without a trace. A streak of azure smoke cut through the night sky. In the end, it landed outside the city god temple of Imperial Accompanying City. A burly martial judge suited in iron armor appeared outside the city god temple and commanded in a solemn voice, "Identify yourself." However, the young sword cultivator simply responded by raising a hand. Sword Immortal slowly slid out from its scabbard before twirling in the air, eventually landing in the hand of the young man in azure. He held the sword horizontally in front of him with one hand, placing the index finger and middle finger of his other hand on the sword blade and slowly sliding them toward the tip of the sword. The sword blade was already a concentrated and resplendent gold to begin with, but its glow became even more brilliant with each inch that the young man's fingers slid down the blade. The young man narrowed his eyes and gazed at the spectacular sword light enveloping his hands, murmuring, "Be it karmic fate or be it a heavenly tribulation, I, Clay Vase Ali's Chan Ping'an, will face it all." The gates of the city god temple opened slowly. Apart from the city god who was facing a perilous predicament, the remaining subordinates of Imperial accompanying city god temple had already been fully mobilized to deal with the imminent calamities. The scholarly judge, the martial judge, and all of the ghostly petty officials of the various departments were carefully standing inside the city god temple. Even though the entire Imperial accompanying city could be regarded as the city god temple's territory, meaning that the subordinates of the temple would receive certain protection from the city's fortune, standing inside the temple that was brimming with abundant incense offerings ultimately allowed them to feel more at ease. Chan Ping'an looked toward the entrance of the city god temple. The city god had chosen to kill one subordinate and spare the other subordinate following that tragic case in the past, so the current shackle and chain general was most likely a newly appointed one. Meanwhile, the main official of the Yinyang department, the primary department of the 6 departments, was presumably still the same individual as before. Holding Sword Immortal in his hand, Chan Ping'an glanced down at his sword nurturing gourd and said, "The two of you are free to do as you please after I launch 2 sword strikes tonight." Chan Ping'an looked up at the city god temple and asked, "Which of you is the main official of the city god temple's Yinyang department?" The scholarly judge, the martial judge, the day and night wandering deity, the shackle and chain general, and the subordinates of the other departments all hurriedly looked toward a middle-aged and scholarly-looking official without any hesitation. The official garb of officials in the city god temples largely followed the same etiquette as those in the mortal imperial courts. They couldn't be careless with the Mandarin squares embroidered on the official garb, although there would be some slight differences between each province and territory. The official robes were largely black and white, and the officials would also carry a bronze official seal engraved with their official titles by their waists. The main official of the Yinyang department trembled with fear and trepidation as he took a step forward, with his eyes darting around in discomfort. He suppressed the fear and panic in his mind, bowing down and cupping his fists in respect as he asked, "Sword Immortal has come to visit the city god temple at night, so please forgive me for failing to welcome you properly. May I ask, for what reason does Sword Immortal seek out this lowly official? Those with good intentions wouldn't visit, and those who visited wouldn't have good intentions." This was a simple principle that he and all of his colleagues in the city god temple understood. Otherwise, they wouldn't have appeared at the main entrance together. In the next moment, the Sword Immortal in azure was already standing inside the city god temple, with the dumbfounded main official of the Yinyang department standing behind him. Even though Chan Ping'an had already barged into the city god temple without invitation, all of the officials including the scholarly judge and the martial judge still symbolically shuffled to the sides as if clearing a path for him. They then looked toward their colleague from the Yinyang department. A straight and thin golden thread appeared from the forehead of the Yinyang department's main official and stretched all the way down. A brief moment later, the godly body of the main official violently exploded into smithereens. Even the martial judge, the official who was most skilled at killing malicious ghosts, and the newly appointed shackle and chain general, someone who liked to venture out of the city to hunt lone ghosts and wandering ghosts, failed to clearly see when the Sword Immortal in azure had unleashed his sword strike and how exactly he had done so. Grim and ashen expressions instantly appeared on the faces of the city god temple's officials. They were going to suffer greatly tonight. This person was genuinely a Sword Immortal who had traveled here from an outside region. They had heard about the eccentric and domineering nature of Sword Immortals before, and this was a breed of cultivators that couldn't be viewed through ordinary lenses. A faint golden glow flowed through the divine statue of the city god in the rear hall of the temple, following which an elderly official with a refined aura stepped out and passed through the front hall without facing any obstructions. He hovered to the steps of the front hall and stood still, extending a finger and scolding in a stern voice, Do you think you can wantonly kill an official formally appointed by the imperial seal of the emperor just because you're a sword cultivator? Qian Ping'an looked up at the thick black mist that was enveloping imperial accompanying city, with its dark and murderous aura seemingly brandishing its claws and gnashing its teeth. This was similar to the pseudo-celestial tool, the peculiar sea of clouds, owned by Old Dragon City's Fu clan. However, that pseudo-celestial tool couldn't be seen by anyone under the level of Earth Immortal, while the black mist enveloping imperial accompanying city was only invisible to ordinary mortals. I'll strive to help you block the heavenly tribulation, so how are you going to thank me? Qian Ping'an asked in response. The city god was stunned to begin with, but sheer delight immediately washed over him as he exclaimed, "For real? Sword Immortal isn't joking and toying around with me." The young Sword Immortal in azure nodded in response. The city god felt like the heavens would always leave people with a way out, and this would give him a glimmer of hope after an extremely difficult period. The city god promised loudly, "As long as Sword Immortal can protect the city god temple from harm, you can feel free to name your price and obtain any treasure of the prefecture. If Sword Immortal finds it troublesome to obtain the treasures by yourself, then just give us the word, and everyone in the city god temple will work to obtain the treasures and offer them up to you. We definitely won't slack off." A ray of golden light slashed down from the sky. The officials of the city god temple were petrified upon seeing this, with their godly bodies becoming unstable as they witnessed the city god, who had been a paramount figure for countless years, suffering the same fate as the main official of the Yang department. A speck of golden light appeared on his forehead, after which a golden thread slowly traveled down his body. However, he was a city god who had enjoyed incense offerings for many years, after all, so his powerful godly body, which had absorbed a countless amount of incense essence over the years, didn't shatter and explode straight away. Not only that, but the city god was even able to raise his hands and forcefully press down on the two sides of his head as he howled in grief. "Have you gone mad? The heavenly tribulation will descend straight away if I'm killed, so will you be able to block the heavenly tribulation by yourself? If I'm still alive, however, then you and I could have joined forces to block the heavenly tribulation together. You're an absolute madman. You're going to suffer a terrible death." Qian Ping'an's gaze shifted above the city god's head, focusing on the divine altar in the front hall where there sat a majestic divine statue that also enjoyed the incense offerings of the prefecture but was dull and lifeless. Was this deity also an accomplice of the city god? Was this deity aware of the imminent calamity facing imperial accompanying city, so had decided to retract his divine spirit from the divine statue in this city god temple? "Sorry, I forgot to mention just then that you needed to thank me with your death," Qian Ping'an said. The city god tightly held his head together with both hands. There were abundant incense offerings that had been forcefully contained inside the city god temple for a long time, and the city god hadn't cared about whether these incense offerings were pure and free from sinister thoughts. Instead, he had absorbed everything regardless of the purity, and he was essentially drinking poison to quench his thirst. With the heavenly tribulation hanging over his head, the city god had no time to care about anything else as he did everything in his ability to increase his cultivation, even if it was only by a sliver. As for whether the city god temple would be destroyed, whether the officials would be killed due to their inadequate cultivation basis, and whether the residents of the prefecture would become collateral damage, the city god had stopped caring about these matters ever since he had suffered a huge blow to his virtue and developed cracks in his godly body. In fact, he had even asked a group of his cultivator friends to travel to the capital with extremely valuable gifts, asking them to persuade the Ministry of Rites, the Ministry of Astronomy, and even the Emperor of the Silver Screen Nation to suppress the news of the heavenly tribulation and prevent the residents of Imperial accompanying city and the wider prefecture from fleeing. Otherwise, they would face the worst-case scenario of the city god temple being destroyed and the feng shui of the nation being severely affected. During this time, the descendants of the scholar who should have received the secret letter of the prefectural overseer were also aware of the severity of the situation, especially the leader of the clan. As such, they also provided a lot of support, utilizing the networks and relationships that they had built up in the imperial court over several generations to plead for mercy on behalf of the city god. It was thanks to this that the city god of imperial accompanying city still saw a sliver of a chance to live through the heavenly tribulation. The city god wanted to sacrifice an entire prefecture to save his godly body. Those who didn't look out for themselves would be destroyed by the heavens. In any case, he was the city god of a prefectural city, a golden deity who viewed mortal rulers as short-lived beings. With his hands still holding his head together, the city god lowered his gaze slightly and looked at the golden thread that was moving down his body at a slower speed. However, it wasn't showing any signs of stopping, and this instilled intense fear in the city god's mind. There was surprisingly a hint of sobbing in his voice as he muttered, "Why is this happening? Why can't the abundant incense offerings stop this golden thread? Sword immortal! Esteemed sword immortal!" The city god standing at the top of the steps no longer appeared haughty and overbearing as he pleaded, "Please spare me, esteemed sword immortal. What matters in the world can't be negotiated in a calm and peaceful manner." The city god didn't dare to raise a hand to point above his head as he continued, "Have a look above, esteemed sword immortal." Without the city god temple drawing on the incense offerings of the temple and borrowing the fortune of the prefecture to resist the heavenly tribulation, can esteemed sword immortal truly block the heavenly tribulation by yourself? Is esteemed sword immortal truly not afraid of eroding your hard-earned cultivation base? The scholarly judge was almost scared out of his wits, and he had initially found this situation to be puzzling and inconceivable as well. After some further thought, however, he immediately came to a realization, one that made him feel even greater despair. This outsider sword immortal was bored and had nothing better to do, so he had come to the city god temple to face a heavenly tribulation head-on. That being the case, would he still care about benefits and losses? If he did, then would he have needed to enter the city god temple in the first place? Didn't the city god always tell his subordinates to remain calm and composed when they encountered unexpected situations? Didn't he tell them to avoid making mistakes due to panic? By the looks of it, the city god wasn't able to do much better himself. However, there was grief and bitterness in the scholarly judge's heart. After all, he wasn't a bystander at this moment, so there was no joke for him to witness. They had overseen the feng shui and fortune of this area for hundreds of years, enjoying lofty positions and peering down at the mortal world. There were countless worshippers who visited the city god temple to offer incense, and these people all came with different mindsets and wishes. There were unbelievably foolish individuals, incredibly lazy young men who prayed for riches, sinister women who hoped to find a loyal husband, children who were unwilling to spend money to treat their seniors' illnesses and came to pray instead, murderous bandits who thought that donating some money and offering a few bunches of incense sticks could eliminate their bad karma, and so on and so forth. There were all kinds of worshippers, and the deities had already become numb from seeing all of their laughable wishes. Was it time for them to suffer the karmic consequences now? Was it the qi refiner's turn to laugh at the city god temple? Qian Pingan ignored the pleading words of the city god, as he stabbed sword immortal into the ground. He then slowly rolled up his sleeves. Unlike at Verdant Bamboo Lake, where he had only rolled up his right sleeve, he also rolled up his left sleeve as well this time, revealing the walnut bracelet on his wrist. As for the 3 talismans that Qian Pingan had obtained from malicious Ghost Valley, he casually slipped them diagonally behind his belt. There was the Pure Jade Illumination Talisman which had already been activated, and also the Cloud Slashing Fiend Talisman, and the Jade Heaven Residence Talisman from the esteemed Mystery Department's lofty Cloud Palace. Only after doing all this did Qian Pingan look at the city god whose golden eyes were slowly becoming ink black. This reminded him of the city god temple in the colorful Garment Nation's Blusher Prefecture. However, city god Shunwen had been schemed against by cultivators from the mountains, while the city god here had asked for this himself. The difference between them was immense. Qian Pingan instantly arrived at the top of the steps, with his hands resting on the hilt of his sword as he stood beside the city god who appeared like a martial artist who had fallen to demonic ways. They were standing side by side, yet they were facing completely different directions. The young swordsman in azure was facing the front hall, where there was the empty shell of a divine statue lifelessly sitting on the divine altar. Meanwhile, the city god who had a golden thread running down his body was facing the entrance of the temple, and facing the many mortal humans. The city god did everything in his power to stop his godly body from exploding, and this was the only thing that he could do at this moment. The culprit who had attacked him was standing right beside him, Yet the city god was completely unable to do anything about him at this moment. The golden thread running down the city god's body started to grow larger and larger, and it was like a violent flood crashing through a levee that a small stream could no longer contain. The city god suddenly laughed and said, "You're quite an impressive sword immortal, huh? Are you also here for that valuable treasure?" The city god, who knew that death was imminent, suddenly roared with hearty laughter, continuing, "What a shame! Otherwise, even if a measly city god of a prefectural city like me died, I could have still forced a large number of immortals to accompany me in death. Just how satisfying would that have been?" Jian Lai suddenly reached over and placed a hand over the city god's face, with his fingers like hooks, as he slowly asked, "What face do you have to take another glance at the world?" The godly body of the city god exploded into tiny pieces, and it was as if a huge ball of golden powder had been released over the front hall of the city god temple. There was a crisp clang as something fell to the ground. This was a rusty golden shard that wasn't small in size. In fact, it was even larger than the combined sizes of the two golden shards of the river gods of verdant bamboo lake. Jian Lai was just about to use the tip of sword immortal to shatter the golden shard, but first, which hadn't appeared for a long time, flew out from the sword nurturing gourd and left a streak of white sword light in its wake as it stabbed into the rusty golden shard. Afterward, both first and the golden shard surprisingly burrowed into the ground and disappeared from view. Following the disintegration of the city god's godly body, heavenly thunder instantly rumbled across the sky above Imperial accompanying city. This was much louder than ordinary thunder, and it was as if exploding firecrackers were booming beside everyone's ears. This caused many sleeping residents in Imperial accompanying city to wake with a start. Black clouds churned in the sky, as if there were ink-black dragons swimming through the sea of clouds. Not only that, but the sea of clouds started to slowly descend and bear down on the city. In the beginning, it was some families in the city who were woken by the booming thunder first, with some getting out of bed to light their oil lamps. Some wealthy families even started to hang up lanterns. Specks of light started to appear in the prosperous prefectural city, continually joining together and lighting up the area. The sound of wailing children also pierced through the silence. In the end, the chi refiners who had secretly entered Imperial accompanying city were all dumbstruck by what they saw. After an initial feeling of fright and panic, they started to let loose a torrent of curses. The valuable treasure was yet to truly appear. Yet this godforsaken heavenly tribulation was already descending upon the city earlier than anticipated. How could they have expected this? There was a very good reason for their frustration and anger. Natural treasures that were born from the fortune of heaven and earth naturally possessed an innate spiritual aura, and were extremely difficult for chi refiners to obtain. Indeed, the city lord of Yellow Axe City had once failed to obtain a rare treasure, because the immortal treasure was able to fly far too quickly. Cultivators in the mountains claimed that the valuable treasure in Imperial accompanying city was of extremely high grade, and it was a treasure formed from the 1,000-year scholarly fortune of the prefecture. Not only that, but it was also said that a military and immortal weapon had also been buried deep underground during the founding of Imperial accompanying city, and in the end, this immortal weapon fused together with the 1,000-year-old scholarly fortune of the prefecture. This created a paramount treasure that possessed both scholarly fortune and martial fortune, allowing it to have both offensive and defensive capabilities. As such, the person who obtained this treasure would be able to ascend the heavens in a single step, becoming a cultivator who stood at the pinnacle of the mountains. It was because of this that Yellow Axe City and the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm, two top-notch immortal forces, had both dispatched cultivators to Imperial accompanying city, and were hellbent on obtaining this valuable treasure. If Yellow Axe City obtained this treasure, then they would genuinely solidify their position as the strongest immortal force in the region containing a dozen or so nations, leaving the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm in the dust. On the other hand, the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm could overtake Yellow Axe City to become the strongest immortal force in the region if it obtained this valuable treasure. Near the ghost residence in Imperial accompanying city, an old cultivator was sitting on a nearby roof, and he became quite annoyed at the small monkey on his shoulder that couldn't be calmed down no matter what. He furiously grabbed the small monkey and threw it away. The local cultivators with low cultivation bases had already noticed the dire nature of the situation, and they started to either sprint or fly as they rapidly fled from Imperial accompanying city. They didn't dare to covet the valuable treasure at all. In any case, they were mainly from the subordinate immortal forces of Yellow Axe City and the treasure basin immortal realm, and they had simply been deployed here to increase the presence of the two forces and cheer them on. Of course, they could also provide a small amount of help if the two forces genuinely started to fight each other. The old cultivator felt extremely frustrated. Things were very troublesome now that it had come to this. Sure enough, there was something wrong with this young sword immortal's brain. Sword immortals were one of the 4 most difficult breeds of cultivators to deal with, and this young sword immortal indeed lived up to the reputation. When sword immortals left the mountains to travel around the cultivation world, all they pursued was unrestrained satisfaction. However, was this heavenly tribulation riddled with karmic fate something that he could block so easily? Even if he managed to block half of the tribulation and was able to flee with his life afterward, would he not end up riddled with unnecessary karmic fate? Don't bother me right now, you horny slut. I'm in a bad mood, the old cultivator suddenly said. There was a woman wearing a wooden hairpin and dressed in a cotton dress standing on the curved eaves of the roof. Her appearance was very ordinary, but how could an ordinary mortal woman stand on the small curved eaves with such stability? She covered her mouth and said with a silvery laugh, "Is this how you speak to an empress? How courageous of you. Master has plotted for a long time to obtain this treasure, so both you and I deserve to die 100 times over for failing to carry out such an important plan," the old cultivator said with a gloomy expression. In fact, Master will only feel angrier due to this awkward situation that's essentially the same as falling at the final hurdle. The woman waved a hand and replied, "Even though I'm unsure of why that treasure has suddenly fallen quiet and is allowing the heavenly tribulation to freely grind down its innate quality, not even seizing an opportunity to flee, it will still be forced to show itself once the heavenly tribulation truly descends. Yellow Axe City and the treasure basin immortal realm have already retreated further in a tactful manner, either heading to the Dragon Palace of Verdant Bamboo Lake to seek shelter or traveling to the more distant Black Glaze Mountain to hide. As such, won't it be easier for you and me to get a head start and seize an opportunity to obtain the treasure afterward?" The woman's expression became serious as she continued, "The two of us have worked together for many years, so allow me to boldly ask you a selfish question. Why is Master unwilling to personally get involved in the matter? With Master's paramount cultivation, even though he expended too much energy to achieve that incredible feat and was forced to cultivate in seclusion, he should have already recovered his peak cultivation after recuperating for several hundred years, right? If Master comes to Imperial accompanying city, then won't that valuable treasure be as good as his? Who would dare to challenge him? Trash like Feng ran. You don't understand shit," the old cultivator sneered. "This is a treasure pertaining to virtue, so is it really the case that those who possess a higher cultivation base can forcefully obtain it with ease? In any case, regardless of how high Master's cultivation base is, he isn't a pure martial artist or a militarian cultivator, so he'll naturally become the primary target of everyone after entering this region. The heavenly tribulation doesn't favor anyone either. So what will happen if Master's cultivation is damaged again, even if he manages to block the tribulation? Will you compensate Master? Will you be able to compensate Master even if you offer him the pathetic treasure chamber of the entire Silver Screen Nation? What an absolute joke." The woman was unfazed by the old cultivator's words of ridicule, and she turned around to look at the city god temple as she said with a frown, "By the looks of it, we'll need to at the very least temporarily leave Imperial accompanying city as well. If we stay too close, will we not be forced to face the heavenly tribulation as the most powerful cultivators in the area? Will we not become punching bags for the heavenly tribulation? However, we can't retreat too far away either. Otherwise, when the rare treasure appears after the heavenly tribulation passes, it will definitely try to flee from this filthy city as quickly as possible. At that time, Yellow Axe City and the treasure basin immortal realm will definitely be extremely quick to react. The two of us can naturally take on City Lord Yihan and Fan Weiran with ease, but the large number of weaklings surrounding them might prove to be an issue. After all, enough ants can kill an elephant." The old cultivator smiled and pointed at the small monkey that had climbed back to the roof ridge and was relentlessly baring its teeth at the city god temple, saying, "Woman, you've been interacting with those so-called royal descendants and officials for far too long. So much so that your observation skills are becoming worse and worse. You haven't realized yet, have you? This is the treasure-engulfing monkey that Master spent a huge sum of money to buy. And it's the descendant of a peculiar primordial beast that set Master back an exorbitant amount of immortal coins. I'm afraid that I'll scare you to death if I tell you the amount. With this monkey present, it can swallow the treasure into its belly. In other words, the current situation isn't as troublesome as you think. However, if your abilities aren't up to scratch and you get held back by Yi Han or Fan Weiran, then let me say this first. I'll leave with the small monkey and leave you behind. As for whether a horny slut vixen like you can continue to enjoy the fortunes of the mortal world and continue to carve the dragon aura of a nation into fox fur, that's completely up to you. Just how many times had this slutty fox played the role of empress already? The old cultivator couldn't help but grumble in his mind. The woman sighed in grief and looked up at the slowly descending sea of black clouds. There was a hint of worry and fear in her eyes as she asked, Master's arch-enemy won't cause trouble for us, will he? Will Yi Han and Fan Weiran truly be the only golden core tier cultivators present? The old cultivator shook his head and replied, the two parties already drew a clear boundary in the past, agreeing that they wouldn't interfere with each other as they each attended to their own needs. As such, there shouldn't be any unexpected surprises. After reaching Master's lofty height, cultivators surprisingly start to care more about promises than weaklings like us. Before I set off, Master said to me that there would only be 2 papier-mâché-like golden core tier cultivators, so the 2 of us could give up on returning if we failed to defeat them. We could find some place to bang our heads against a wall and commit suicide. The woman nodded in response, and a look of fervor appeared in her naturally charming eyes as she exclaimed, That's truly a good sword. It's definitely an immortal treasure. Even the Earth Immortal sword cultivators from outside regions will be tempted by such a good sword. The old cultivator smiled and said, Even blind fools on the streets can see this, so is there any need for you to announce it? What, are you tempted as well? Then why don't you go over and snatch it? The woman turned around and made eyes at him, replying, Old geezer, all you spout is nonsense. Even if I want to snatch it, that will have to wait until this impudent person is beaten half dead by the heavenly tribulation. The old cultivator clicked his tongue in wonder and remarked, It's been a long time since we last met, and it seems like your cultivation has indeed advanced by a little. For a woman to not rely on her appearance and only rely on her eyes to enchant a person, you are indeed quite capable in this regard. How about the 2 of us enjoy some intimacy after we obtain the treasure? Absence makes the heart grow fonder. And how many hundreds of years have we been apart already? The woman tapped her foot and dashed away, with her silvery laugh sounding like chiming bells as her lingering voice replied, It will be too late if you don't retreat now, old geezer. Let's continue to discuss things after we leave Imperial Accompanying City. I'll be all yours after we successfully obtain the treasure for Master. The old cultivator grabbed the small monkey and placed it on his shoulder, after which he flew out of Imperial Accompanying City with the woman. The 2 of them were naturally suppressing their cultivation bases, or else they would attract unnecessary trouble if they caught the attention of Yi Han and Fan Weiran. Even though the large majority of these cultivators only knew how to act in a haughty and domineering manner in their own territories, this was ultimately a very large territory that encompassed a dozen or so nations. As a result, 1 or 2 exceptionally prodigious talents would naturally emerge every 100 years, talents that couldn't be underestimated. Even though the old cultivator and the woman spoke about Yi Han and Fan Weiran in a derisive manner, they definitely still needed to be careful once they engaged in life and death combat with these 2 golden core tier cultivators. The 2 of them flew over the city walls of Imperial Accompanying City one after another. There were still many chi refiners who didn't fear death standing on the city walls, and they most likely believed that they would face much less danger once they left Imperial Accompanying City. With this belief in mind, they continued to feign calm and composure as they stood there and commented on the current situation. Among these cultivators was a young chi refiner who had been placed near the city god temple by his immortal force, concealing his identity and disguising himself as the shopkeeper of an incense shop for many years. After finally dropping his disguise now, he was especially fervent as he shouted abuse, saying that the person who looked like a young sword cultivator had either been dropped on his head as a baby or had his head kicked by a donkey. After arriving at the city god temple, This outsider had immediately hacked the main official of the Yin-Yang department to death without trying to understand the situation first. After entering the city god temple, he further brandished his might and directly launched a sword strike at the city god. However, it was a shame that the gates of the city god temple were closed afterward, preventing them from seeing the commotion inside. A nearby cultivator smiled and said that this sword cultivator clearly felt like he couldn't obtain the valuable treasure, so he was attacking the city god to make sure that no one else could obtain it either. His intentions were sinister, and he deserved death for his ill will. If this young cultivator was lucky enough to survive the heavenly tribulation, then they definitely needed to have some sparring matches with him afterward. The old cultivator with the small monkey on his shoulder found this extremely amusing as he slowly flew over the city gates, thinking to himself that the more of these foolish and ill-intentioned people, the better. Of course, there also needed to be more people who were as stubborn and pedantic as the late prefectural overseer, as these types of people would allow more of the former to exist. Otherwise, if everyone in the world were smart, how could he and the seductive woman, who was promoting debauchery in the imperial palace of the Silver Screen Nation, take advantage of other people and reap all of the large and small benefits in the world? Inside the city god temple, First quickly resurfaced after burrowing into the ground with the rusty golden shard of the city god. A streak of white light flew around the city god temple, killing more than half of the Yin officials including the martial judge, the day and night wandering deity, and the ghost officials of the various departments. In the end, only the scholarly judge, the newly appointed shackle and chain general, and some low-ranking ghost officials were spared from the deadly blade of First. This time, 15th remained inside the sword nurturing gourd the entire time, deciding that it didn't need to appear. Chan Ping'an flicked his sleeve and swept the golden shards into his hand, following which he placed them inside his minimization treasure. Some of the golden shards were faint gold in color, while some of the golden shards were pure silver in color. Afterward, Chan Ping'an continued to gaze up at the sea of black clouds that was already less than 900 meters above Imperial accompanying city. After thinking for a moment, he retrieved the golden barrier-shattering talisman that had yet to fully combust when he had used it at Verdant Bamboo Lake. If this wasn't enough, then he would try the pure jade illumination talisman as well. Of course, he would naturally rely on his own strength as the primary means to block the heavenly tribulation tonight. As for what he used afterward, this didn't matter at all. First was still dashing around the city god temple, leading a loud ringing sound in its wake as it tore through the air. Chan Ping'an looked over at the subordinates and Yin officials of the city god temple who didn't dare to move at all. He only took a single glance at them, upright and loyal, compassionate to all beings, governing on behalf of the heavens, eradicating evil and vanquishing criminals. First had seemingly decided to spare the remaining Yin officials already, yet it suddenly sped up, with a streak of white sword light piercing through several ghost officials who were from the departments responsible for punishing evil and bestowing longevity, causing them to instantly disintegrate and vanish. Chan Ping'an took a deep breath and turned around, no longer looking at the Yin officials who enjoyed incense offerings alongside the city god. "You're not going to leave? Perhaps you want to stay in the city god temple, to face the heavenly tribulation with me." The remaining Yin officials hurriedly fled from the city god temple, hoping to run as far away as possible. It would naturally be even better if they could flee from Imperial accompanying city. A middle-aged man with a big beard surprisingly walked into the city god temple, having furiously spat on the ground when standing outside the entrance just then. After entering the front hall and seeing the young sword immortal regulating his breathing and focusing his concentration, the man hesitated for a moment before asking in a muffled voice, "What are you doing here?" From an official perspective, I shouldn't encourage you to leave as a local deity of the prefectural city, as it's naturally in my interest to reduce the number of deaths befalling the residents of the prefecture. From a private perspective, however, I still hope that you can extract yourself from these troublesome matters. It's not that I have no confidence in the lofty immortal techniques of a sword immortal like you, but heavenly tribulations are genuinely the most troublesome things in the world. It's not the case that everything will be fine and auspicious if you manage to block the heavenly tribulation. Since you're a sword immortal, how can you not understand the intricate and roundabout reasons behind this? Cultivation isn't easy, so why subject yourself to something like this? Chan Ping'an turned around and asked, "Are you from the fire god shrine?" The middle-aged man nodded and replied, I truly must have committed a grave crime when I was alive, being forced to serve as the deity of the fire god shrine even after death. I've never enjoyed a comfortable day in the past several hundred years. When the prefectural overseer was still a child, were you the one who protected him and helped him leave Imperial accompanying city? Chen Ping'an asked. The fire god cracked a grin and replied, if you had asked me this question when the city god was still alive, I wouldn't have dared to admit it even if I were beaten to death again. Chen Ping'an smiled and said, you can leave now. There's no need to persuade me any further. In any case, you're a deity of Imperial accompanying city, so when the heavenly tribulation descends, I surmise that you'll face life and death danger much earlier than me. That's not an issue, the fire god replied in a carefree voice. Only after becoming the deity of a region did I truly understand the meaning of life being worse than death. Being fully dead is much better than being half dead. But before I die fully, let me carry a small stool to the roof of the fire god shrine. I'll sit there and open my eyes wide to observe the fabled might and demeanor of sword immortals. Chen Ping'an nodded in response. The fire god turned around to leave. When he reached the entrance, he suddenly turned around and asked, as the deity of a region, I've failed to do anything useful. You're clearly a blunt and good-intentioned sword immortal, so do you not blame me for anything? Are you not going to punish me? Disregarding who I am and what my cultivation base is and simply focusing on this world, if someone has the strength and energy to complain about a good person not doing good enough, then I won't ask too much of these people and hope that they'll step forward to kill evildoers. But can they not at least muster some energy to scold evildoers for doing evil? Chen Ping'an said in response. The fire god laughed heartily and strode away, replying, this is naturally because good people, good ghosts, and good deities are easy to pick on. As a sword immortal from the outside regions, this question of yours is truly very naive and foolish. After stepping over the door threshold, the fire god cupped his hands in respect and raised them above his head, rocking them back and forth a few times as he strode away. Only the rough and unrestrained voice of the big-bearded fire god reverberated through the night sky, saying, however, if you weren't foolish, then you wouldn't have entered this filthy rat hole of a city god temple. Don't die, sword immortal. There are already too few good and capable people in this shitty world. If you act too rashly and truly die in this worthless and crappy place, then I'll make sure to angrily scold you at that time. Chen Ping'an threw the golden barrier-shattering talisman toward the overbearing sea of black clouds, testing the might of the heavenly tribulation. The golden talisman exploded at the bottom of the clouds and created a gigantic golden crater that was as large as the city god temple. However, the sea of black clouds churned and quickly filled in the crater. Observing the clouds just then, Chen Ping'an had seen that the sea of black clouds was extremely thick, with the golden talisman showing no sign of reaching the top of the clouds. Chen Ping'an took a deep breath. He rested his hands on the hilt of his sword and gazed up at the sky. He could unleash the first sword strike when the sea of clouds descended to a height of 300 meters. However, he could unleash his fists first when the clouds descended to a height of 600 meters, after the unexpected phenomenon appeared at the city god temple. Fan Weiran, who was currently staying at Imperial accompanying city, made a quick and resolute decision to hurriedly leave the city with the cultivators of the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm, making their way to Verdant Bamboo Lake. At the same time, she also instructed a few subordinates to warn the chi refiners belonging to their subordinate immortal forces to make haste and head to Verdant Bamboo Lake as well. Lake Lord Inho owed her a big favor after all. Moreover, the Lake Lord was severely wounded right now, so he most likely wouldn't dare to let his lecherous eyes wander like he had at the banquet back then. It was due to Lake Lord Inho's unwelcome gaze that Yan Qing had requested leave from her old ancestor, leaving the banquet at the Dragon Hall and heading to the water goddess shrine of Algae Stream's Canal Master to get some fresh air. Afterward, trouble and commotion had come one after another. Yan Qing had felt slightly uneasy after arriving at Imperial accompanying city, and to say nothing of Fan Weiran, even the juniors of Yan Qing had noticed that something was amiss. This caused Fan Weiran to feel even deeper hatred toward that young sword immortal. He actually dared to disturb little Yan's Dao heart. That immortal had already decided that Yan Qing would become one of the leaders of the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm, as well as the immortal forces in the mountains of the dozen or so nations. So once Yan Qing realized her potential and soared to great heights, the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm would be able to receive another lofty immortal cultivation technique. After all these years, Yellow Axe City and the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm were nothing more than two pawns that had been secretly chosen in the fish pond that contained the dozen or so nations. They were arch-enemies with each other and always fighting to the death, but how many cultivators of the two immortal forces had truly lost their lives in these skirmishes? Only very few of them had died, and those who had died were all cultivators who seemingly possessed high cultivation bases but were actually no longer able to attain the Great Tao. In reality, the majority of deaths had been suffered by cultivators from the subordinate forces of Yellow Axe City and the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm. Also, 200 years had already passed, so why had not a single Vajrabhati tier martial artist appeared in the cultivation world of the dozen or so nations? One had to realize that the final Vajrabhati tier martial artist had been killed by City Lord Yihan and Fan Weiran's junior sister. Right now, which of those so-called martial artists' superior grandmasters, 6th tier martial artists who were flaunting their abilities in the mortal nations, weren't enjoying their comfortable lives in peace? Be it the strongest sword practitioner or the best at fist techniques, however, which of them wasn't decaying away and facing imminent death? Fan Weiran turned around to glance at Yanqing, who was standing beside her, smiling faintly as she did so. Her junior sister hadn't understood why she had needed to kill that Vajrabhati tier martial artist back then, but Fan Weiran was well aware of the reason. After all, this was a huge secret that only a single person in each of Yellow Axe City and the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm could be aware of at any given time. This had always been the case. As for the other immortal forces, they didn't have the right or the opportunity to even seek an audience with that immortal. Regarding the sword immortal from an outside region who had mysteriously appeared here, it would be best if he were struck by the heavenly tribulation and accidentally killed inside the city god temple. However, even this could be considered a merciful death for that person. Otherwise, if he only suffered severe wounds and was captured by Fan Weiran, the sinister water lamps in Lake Lord Inho's verdant bamboo lake would be nothing compared to the secret techniques of the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm's ancestral hall. The cultivators of the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm and its subordinate forces all traveled in one direction, hurriedly making their way to verdant bamboo lake. Those unable to fly on the wind could only rely on their legs to sprint over the land, while those even weaker could only ride horses to flee the city. After soaring into the sky and leaving Imperial accompanying city, Fan Weiran suddenly asked, "Did the mediocre militarian cultivators of the Ghost Axe Palace not follow us out of the city?" A cultivator who had disguised as a subordinate and a guest literati of the prefectural overseer stood beside the old ancestor and replied in a respectful voice, "After receiving my warning at an inn, the cultivators of the Ghost Axe Palace didn't leave straight away for some unknown reason, saying that they still needed to deal with some urgent matters. I didn't dare to linger, so I decided to take my leave first. In the end, I noticed them leaving Imperial accompanying city in another direction, so I'm temporarily unsure of whether they'll meet up with us at verdant bamboo lake." Anger welled up in Fan Weiran's chest, and there was a murderous look on her face as she asked, "And what about that person called to you? Did you see him at the inn?" "I saw him with the other cultivators at the inn," the elderly cultivator replied. "Sure enough, he's just as the rumors describe, grinning frivolously and immaturely and a pathetic good-for-nothing." The commotion at verdant bamboo lake had been very large that night, but none of the cultivators at Imperial accompanying city had dared to travel over to spectate the battle from up close. When it came to immortal battles involving lofty individuals such as Lake Lord Inho, those partaking in the battle wouldn't appreciate being observed by other people. Instead, they might casually flick their sleeves and mercilessly kill the nosy spectators. In any case, the powerful immortal tools and the deadly immortal techniques that they unleashed would be indiscriminate, so those who willingly challenged death could very well get their wish and die for nothing. With this in mind, the elderly cultivator asked in puzzlement, "Why is old ancestor specifically asking about this person?" Fan Weiran's expression was dark, but she didn't reveal the secrets to the elderly cultivator, simply smiling coldly and replying, "I'll deal with this bastard later." Of course, the prerequisite was that the outsider sword immortal with the surname Chan Ping'an died, or was left half dead by the heavenly tribulation bearing down on Imperial accompanying city. Yanqing glanced back at the hazy silhouette of Imperial accompanying city as she soared through the sky. She could vaguely see a golden talisman blowing a huge hole into the bottom of the sea of black clouds. A manifestation of the heavenly tribulation. Yin Qing sighed softly in her mind. This young sword immortal so good at reading people was actually a foolish idiot. Die. Atop the peak of Black Glaze Mountain, which was even further away from Imperial accompanying city than verdant Bamboo Lake, there stood a tall middle-aged man in a relatively simple scenic pavilion. He was dressed as simply as a slightly well-off man from the mortal cities, and the only ornament he was wearing was a jade tablet hanging by his waist. The man extended a finger and lightly ran it over the seal script characters engraved on the jade tablet, clearly lost in thought with something weighing on his mind as he did so. He Lu was sitting beside him, and the handsome young prodigy was holding his yellowing bamboo flute and gently cleaning this beloved immortal tool of his with a precious immortal satin cloth. The middle-aged man simply gazed at the distant Imperial accompanying city, where the thick sea of black clouds was slowly descending as if the entire sky were crushing down on the mortal world. Looking over from a distance, he was still unable to see the top of the sea of clouds. A white-haired old man sitting cross-legged near the middle-aged man clicked his tongue in wonder and chuckled. Heaven and earth meeting for no reason is a sign of huge calamity for the mortal world. City Lord, I estimate that the mountain and water formation of Black Glaze Mountain will be done for following the descent of this heavenly tribulation. That woman with the surname Fan has planned things out in a much more careful and meticulous manner, forming ties with Lake Lord In Ho of Verdant Bamboo Lake. In this sense, she's gained an advantage on us, seeing that we were only able to choose Black Glaze Mountain and spend our own money to construct a formation. The white-haired old man massaged his legs as he continued in a miserable manner. I truly don't know what that outsider sword immortal is thinking. Even if he wants to snatch the valuable treasure from the jaws of us or the treasure basin immortal realm, he should at least wait for the treasure to appear first, no? However, if he were truly the person who killed the city god, then the heavenly tribulation will naturally target him instead. In that case, what the fuck is he hoping to achieve? City Lord, I'm not exactly a very bright person, so why don't you explain this to me? My mind itches whenever I come across something that I can't make heads or tails of, or whenever I come across a breathtaking yet dangerously untouchable beauty. The middle-aged man standing in the scenic pavilion was none other than City Lord Yi Han of Yellow Axe City. An outsider sword immortal has barged over here and caused chaos on the chessboard. But the chessboard is ultimately still the same chessboard with little change to the actual situation. The uncertainties introduced by this person's high cultivation base will largely be eliminated by the heavenly tribulation. What I'm worried about isn't this outsider sword immortal, nor is it the treasure basin immortal realm or Fan Wei Ran. Instead, it's a few other outsiders who are much sneakier than this bold and honorable sword immortal. Right now, I only know that the seductive empress of the Silver Screen Nation is one of these outside cultivators. The white-haired old man's interest was immediately piqued at the mention of the seductive empress, and he remarked, "The emperor of the Silver Screen Nation is like flowing water. The empress of the nation is like forged iron. Haha, how entertaining. As it turns out, she's a cultivator from the outside regions as well. That explains my puzzlement about how our dozen or so nations were able to raise a five-tailed heavenly fox." Yi Han shook his head and corrected, "She's concealed her cultivation base very well, and she's actually a golden core tier fox spirit with 6 tails." Yellow Axe City exchanged the life of a Dragon Gate tier cultivator for this piece of news. The white-haired old man was astonished and he exclaimed, "Then I'll need to take a detour around her whenever I see her in the future. Fucking hell, a golden core tier cultivator. Then isn't she on the same level as City Lord?" He Lu simply continued to clean his bamboo flute, having no interest in these secrets that could already be regarded as the most important matters in the mountains. Yi Han shook his head and replied, "There exist huge gulfs in strength even between cultivators at the same cultivation base. Fox spirits naturally possess incredible skills when it comes to tempting mortal humans, but they've always been lacking when it comes to fighting on the battlefield. Taking this into account, I don't think that she can necessarily defeat Fan Wei Ran in battle. However, since she's come from the outside regions, she definitely possesses 1 or 2 unique immortal tools. In any case, I won't have a big chance of victory either if I'm to fight against Fan Wei Ran, and I'll have close to 0 chance of being able to successfully kill her." Yi Han turned around, smiling as he continued, "If the opportunity arises, and if the sword on that outsider sword immortal's back is genuinely an immortal treasure, Then I can fight to obtain it after he suffers at the hands of the heavenly tribulation. I'll see whether I can barter with him for the sword. If I succeed, then I can gift the sword to you." The white-haired old man was at a loss as he asked, "City Lord, how exactly are you going to barter for it? Also, is there any need for you to fight for it and barter with that outsider?" Yihan shook his head and replied, "There are some questions that you shouldn't ask." He Lu's eyes lit up when he heard City Lord Yihan's promise, and when the handsome young man glanced toward Imperial accompanying City out of the corners of his eyes suddenly became increasingly bright like a blazing torch. Yihan shook his head and said, "Don't even think about it. To say nothing of you, even I don't dare to have any additional thoughts." Yihan's expression became serious as he used his mind's lake to say, "He Lu, the great battle is imminent, so I have to warn you about a few things now. Your aptitude and your fortune are slightly better than Yan Qing's, and this allowed you to accompany me to the immortal residence to meet the immortal. Even though the immortal didn't appear and only instructed a subordinate to welcome the two of us, this is already a very big honor. In this sense, you've already pulled ahead of Yan Qing. However, when it comes to cultivating in the mountains, reaching a high cultivation base is only half of the journey. Upon reaching these heights, the difference between a single cultivation base is like the gulf between heaven and earth. Because of this, even the lowly attendants at the immortal residence dared to rely on that immortal's backing to treat me with disrespect. That valuable treasure has already revealed its roots to you before, showing that it's an innate sword talent. Sword talents in the world fall into two categories: one human and one object. Regarding the former, it can be determined whether a person is an innate sword talent with the potential to become an incredibly rare sword immortal when they're still in their mother's womb. Regarding the latter, things are even more mysterious, and these objects can allow qi refiners who aren't innate sword talents to become sword immortals. This is an extraordinarily rare treasure, so even if I'm able to subtly defeat the other cultivators and secretly obtain it, will you, He Lu, be able to safeguard it if I gift it to you?" He Lu put his bamboo flute away and stood up, replying in a respectful voice, "This disciple understands." Atop a mountain located to the north of Imperial accompanying City, a saber-bearing man who had already put on his divine dew-bearing armor turned around and looked toward the city god temple. You didn't understand this? He couldn't understand it no matter how he racked his brain. Why was the mighty senior, who was exceptionally good at calculating gains and losses and reading other people, acting so rashly right now? How could the lives of some tens of thousands of mortal humans possibly compare to the life and cultivation base of a sword immortal? Do you would dare to loudly shout this morally atrocious remark, even if the mighty senior were standing in front of him right now? He would pose this question even if he faced the risk of being left half dead with a single slap, or worse yet, having his soul imprisoned again. Amid the darkness of night, the sea of black clouds continued to descend, and it appeared as if heaven and earth were about to collide. Apart from the cultivators at the Dragon Palace of Verdant Bamboo Lake, and inside the pavilion atop Black Glaze Mountain, where both Fan Weiran and Yihan had made some sacrifices to allow them to witness the final scenes at the city god temple, all of the other qi refiners from the mountains had fled in various directions, and were able to see even less than the mere mortals in Imperial accompanying City, who were destined for a lifetime of mediocrity. However, even Fan Weiran, Yanqing, Yihan, and He Lu were only able to observe a narrow band of space 300 meters above the ground and 300 meters beneath the sea of bat clouds. A young man in azure stood on his flying sword and relentlessly unleashed punch after punch. The sea of black clouds continued to slowly descend, eventually reaching a height of 300 meters above Imperial accompanying City. It was at this point that both Fan Weiran and Yihan retracted their mystical abilities at almost the exact same time, with their faces slightly pale. The final scene they witnessed was a blade of golden sword light rising from the earth, seemingly surging from the south to the north as it instantly sliced apart the vast sea of black clouds. Afterward, only rumbling thunder could be heard in the prefecture as sword light danced through the sea of black clouds, carrying with it hints of fleeting talisman light. When heaven and earth finally fell silent again, the sea of black clouds enveloping the entire Imperial accompanying City slowly dissipated into nothingness. Inside the government prison located in Imperial accompanying City, a strange ray of sword light that was far more pitch black than the night sky pierced through the ground and drew an extremely thin and long black line through the sky, after which it rapidly soared into the distance. As if in tacit understanding, both Yi Han, who was standing in the pavilion atop Black Glaze Mountain, and Fan Weiran, who was standing in the Dragon Palace under verdant bamboo lake, issued a command in unison, ordering the disciples of their immortal forces to get ready to fight for the valuable treasure. Like sprouting bamboo shoots after a bout of spring rain, hundreds upon thousands of people rushed after the black line in the sky. There were official immortals from a variety of backgrounds, vagrant cultivators who were attempting to snatch the treasure, and martial artists from the cultivation world who usually depended on chi refiners. After the pitch-black sword light soared 50 or so kilometers into the distance, a small monkey suddenly appeared in the sword light's path and swallowed it into its belly. Afterward, an elderly cultivator hid the small monkey inside his sleeve before turning around to flee. A frenzied pursuit and a chaotic battle thus broke out. Only an unremarkable cultivator from the Ghost Axe Palace rapidly sprinted toward Imperial accompanying city. Including the city wall, all of the structures taller than 21 meters in Imperial accompanying city looked as if they had been decapitated by a single sword slash. The young man dressed in snow-white armor leaped onto the severed city wall, and hesitated for a moment before deciding against entering the city straight away. He walked along the city wall and circled around the entire city once, and what he saw was the city god temple, which had already transformed into a pile of rubble. Many tall buildings belonging to wealthy clans had collapsed to the ground as well. There was a cacophony of harsh sounds rising and falling in the city, including the deafening shouts and loud wails from countless people. Lights were blazing in almost every single house, and ever since the founding of Imperial accompanying city, there had most likely never been a single night when everyone in the city had lit their candles and lamps in unison, regardless of how wealthy or poor they were. It was so bright that it almost appeared like day. Jiu gritted his teeth and made up his mind. He didn't dare to fly through the city, so he retracted his divine dew-bearing armor, and placed the armor pellet inside his sleeve before quietly jumping down from the city wall. He didn't dare to walk along the main streets either, so he purposely made his way around the small streets and alleys as he sprinted toward the city god temple. There was the incessant sound of wailing children as he navigated through the city, and the women were busy consoling the children as the men swore and cursed. Most of the elderly residents were reciting religious scriptures and kowtowing to deities at home, with some of them striking their wooden fish if they owned one. Meanwhile, some bold hooligans were snooping around and hoping to find a chance to strike riches. As for the wealthy families, they started to put up the talismans that they had spent huge sums of money to purchase from the shrines and Taoist temples, not caring about whether these talismans worked or not and simply focusing on getting them up first. After arriving on the main street outside the city god temple, Jiu rushed inside the temple, only to see a bloody and mangled person who didn't have a single patch of uninjured flesh on his body. He was standing still with his hands resting on his sword. Jiu glanced at the long sword that was glowing with a dim golden light. However, he furiously shook his head and violently slapped himself a few times, after which he put his palms together in a prayer and said softly with a determined expression, "Rest assured, Senior, and trust me this one time. This isn't a place to linger around, so let me carry you to a quieter and more secluded place." After saying this, Jiu waited for a short moment before continuing. "Since Senior isn't saying anything, I'll take that as a yes?" In the end, Jiu walked over to the bloodied person and his sword. He was just about to squat down and place Chan Ping'an on his back. However, this resulted in him failing to witness a sight that could have shattered his courage. The mighty senior, who barely resembled a human at this moment, slowly turned his head ever so slightly and subtly moved a finger. High up in the sky, an outsider cultivator who was hovering in midair hesitated for a moment before flying into the distance. Jiu smacked his head in realization. The mighty senior's sword was in the way, so how could he possibly carry the senior like this? Jiu wanted to lightly pry open Chan Ping'an's fingers, but he discovered that they wouldn't move at all. A sullen expression appeared on his face as he thought anxiously about what he should do. His finger lightly brushed over the hilt of the sword, and he was surprisingly thrown back in a violent manner, with his soul shuddering violently. This instant burst of pain was no inferior to the time when the mighty senior had imprisoned his soul at the water immortal shrine of Peony Stream's canal master. Jiu struggled to get up, with his face deathly pale as he coughed up a large mouthful of blood. He spread his hand open, only to see that his offending finger had almost been directly transformed into a stick of charcoal. However, the sword suddenly shuddered by itself and flew out from under the mighty senior's hand, gracefully flying behind him and lightly returning to the scabbard on his back. The powerful cultivator, hovering in the sky and continuing to use an immortal observation technique to observe the matters in the ruins of the city god temple, heaved a soft sigh, one that was seemingly filled with a sense of pity. Only then did he truly leave. After all of this, Du was finally able to carry the bloodied Qian Ping'an on his back, with the latter's wound so deep that his bones could be seen in many places. Du was like a headless chook as he walked through the narrow alleys and leaped onto the severed city walls, and in the end, he was finally able to find an abandoned and derelict courtyard after a long period of difficult searching. Du kicked open the door of a small room that was covered in cobwebs, and he had initially planned to place the bloodied Qian Ping'an on the bed. Upon seeing the dusty broken wooden bed and had no blankets, however, he had no option but to use his foot to drag a rotten rocking chair over, and gently place the mighty senior onto the chair that was creaking in protest. Du was now covered in blood as well, and he retrieved a porcelain bottle and lightly placed it beside the rocking chair. He then took several steps back and wiped away the sweat on his forehead, saying, "Senior, I'm scared of death. I'm truly very scared of death, so this is all that I can do." He then smiled bitterly and continued, "If Senior doesn't die, yet I'm captured while Senior is still recuperating, then I'll still truthfully reveal the address of this hiding place to my captors." The person on the wooden rocking chair remained deathly silent. Du cupped his fists in respect and left the small room, quietly closing the door behind him. His brain had already turned into mush at this moment. He had initially wanted to flee from Imperial Accompanying City as quickly as possible, deciding what to do after he returned to the Ghost Axe Palace and reunited with his parents. However, he immediately came to his senses after he left the small room and stepped into a gust of cold wind. No, he definitely couldn't return to the Ghost Axe Palace by himself. Not only that, but the most important thing to do right now was to wash away the discontinuous trail of blood. This was both in order to save the mighty senior and to save himself. After making up his mind, Du's legs no longer felt like jelly anymore, and he started to silently backtrack and clean away the blood. As he did so, Du started to ponder how he would deal with the current situation if he were the mighty senior. After Du closed the door and left, Qian Ping'an, who was half dead as he lay limply in the wooden rocking chair, slowly opened his profoundly deep eyes before slowly closing them again. When dawn arrived the next day, all of the officials in Imperial Accompanying City, regardless of their rank, and all of the residents in the city, regardless of their wealth, started to busily clean up in apprehension and unease. When the residents gradually heard about the incident that had taken place at the city god temple last night, a rumor somehow started to spread, claiming that it was the city god who had helped them block the mysterious sea of black clouds last night, ultimately causing the entire city god temple to suffer a huge calamity. Upon learning of this, the residents of the city started to flood toward the ruins of the city god temple, offering incense and kowtowing in respect outside the ruins. It wasn't long before all of the incense shops on the surrounding streets were cleared of their stock, and there were even many cases of chaotic brawls erupting due to people fighting over incense sticks. The fire god shrine also experienced the same commotion as the city god temple. Of course, the shrine had already become rubble as well, and the clay-crafted divine statue honored in the shrine had already fallen to the ground and smashed into countless pieces. 2 days later, many unfamiliar faces started to appear in Imperial Accompanying City again, and 1 day later, the previously grief-stricken prefectural overseer of the city no longer appeared as disheveled as an ant on a burning wok. There was a healthy red glow on his face as he issued a command, ordering all of the petty officials to search for a young person in azure with a vermilion wine gourd by his waist. Everyone was handed a portrait of this young man, and it was said that he was a terribly vicious criminal who had traveled here from the outside regions. The more they looked at the portrait, the more they believed that this young man was indeed a sinister criminal. In addition to this, the prefectural office was also offering a huge reward for any news regarding this criminal's whereabouts, with 100 gold coins rewarded to anyone who provided valuable information. If someone could lead the officials to the criminal's hiding place, then they could even receive the prefectural overseer's recommendation and become a ranked official. This being the case, it wasn't just the petty officials who scoured the city for the young man in azure. Instead, many wealthy clans well informed about matters in the city also treated this as an enticing opportunity to potentially strike riches, with many of their servants and descendants pouring through the streets to look for the young criminal. Not only was Imperial accompanying city hunting Changping'an, but all of the surrounding prefectural cities and provincial cities were going all out to hunt this so-called criminal as well. One day passed, and the residents of Imperial accompanying city all noticed the strange nature of the matter. Many more fabled immortals appeared above the city, soaring through the sky and riding on mists and clouds. Upon catching sight of these immortals, everyone in the city would fall to their knees and kowtow, regardless of whether they were old or young, men or women. On this night, however, a big bearded man who looked like a clay-crafted divine statue suddenly appeared from the fire god shrine, towering dozens of meters into the air. He relied on the extremely sincere incense offerings that he had obtained a few days ago to forcefully summon one last burst of energy, summoning his true body as his godly body teetered on the edge of destruction and loudly describing the righteous deeds of that sword immortal. The sword immortal definitely hadn't been trying to harm the city god temple, and he definitely wasn't a criminal from outside who had brought calamity to the city. The frantic words of the fire god instantly spread throughout the entire city. The residents exchanged baffled glances with each other, while the prefectural overseer felt anger and embarrassment as he stood inside the prefectural office. However, before he could say anything, an immortal treasure flew over from extremely far away and violently slammed into the deity of the fire god shrine. The big bearded fire god instantly shattered into pieces, transforming into specks of golden light that dissipated into the surroundings. Even so, the immortal treasure was relentless as it directly annihilated the entire fire god shrine. Evening arrived, and a young man dressed in snow-white robes and carrying a vermilion wine gourd by his waist walked toward the abandoned ghost residence, walking inside and closing the door behind him. Night fell, and he held a bamboo fan in one hand as he sat on the roof ridge, admiring the moon as he drank. In the end, he surprisingly became drunk, lying down on the rooftop and falling fast asleep. Apart from being slightly pale, this young man truly appeared like an otherworldly immortal in the eyes of Imperial accompanying city's residents. After he appeared, almost all of the chi refiners in the city silently retreated like a receding tide. This was because two cultivators had been unwilling to give up and had approached the ghost residence late one night. However, two specks of sword light had pierced through their heads just as they neared the courtyard wall, killing them on the spot. Afterward, Changping'an had visited the fire god shrine and offered 3 sticks of incense, following which he had returned to the eerie ghost residence. On this day, an especially eye-catching visitor appeared in the ghost residence. It was none other than the ghost X Palace's Du. In the courtyard of the ghostly residence, the sword immortal in white was sitting on a small stool while Du stood beside him and said in an aggrieved voice, "Senior, I'm truly going to die this time. Why is Senior insisting on keeping me here? I simply came here to check on Senior's safety." Changping'an lightly rocked his bamboo fan back and forth, and Du felt like the smile on Changping'an's face was slightly strange and unfamiliar as the latter said slowly, "No, you would have truly died if I allowed you to leave today." Die. Inside the Dragon Palace at the bottom of verdant bamboo lake, City Lord Yi Han of Yellow Axe City was surprisingly sitting opposite to his archenemy, the Treasure Basin Immortal Realms Fan Wei Ran. The two immortal forces and their subordinate forces stood to the left and the right based on allegiance, and they stood in order of the power of their immortal forces and then the cultivation base of each person. This was the first time that so many immortal cultivators had gathered in the Dragon Palace. Lake Lord Ho didn't sit on his dragon throne atop the platform either, and he instead sat lazily on the steps leading to the throne. This way it appeared like the 3 forces were on equal standing. Yen Qing and He Lu were respectively sitting beside Fan Weiran and Yi Han. The 2 immortal forces had already reached a consensus regarding one matter. Since the valuable treasure had already been snatched away by an accomplice of the Sword Immortal with the surname Chan, and the Sword Immortal had suffered severe wounds due to the heavenly tribulation, forcing him to stay in Imperial accompanying city to recuperate, there was no reason to let him leave the Silver Screen Nation alive. The most favorable outcome would be to directly kill him in Imperial accompanying city. According to the explanation of Lake Lord Ho, this Sword Immortal possessed many more valuable treasures in addition to the immortal sword on his back. In fact, everyone who participated in the hunt and execution of this sword immortal could receive a fair share of these treasures. Fan Weiran smiled coldly and asked, "Then who should we send to gauge this person's strength?" The 2 pieces of lower 5-tier trash who died confused deaths clearly weren't up to the task. City Lord Yi, your Yellow Axe City has a large number of disciples, so how about you send some people? The cultivators on Yihan's side started to smack the tables and abuse Fan Weiran in anger. After facing many twists and turns during their pursuit of the elderly cultivator, whose small monkey had swallowed the valuable treasure, both Yellow Axe City and the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm had already suffered a brutal number of casualties. He Lu suddenly smiled faintly and said, "Cultivators with low cultivation bases and the even more inferior martial artists will be completely unable to gauge this person's true strength. In reality, I feel like even I won't necessarily be able to succeed if I go." Sitting on the steps leading to the platform in the middle of the palace, Lake Lord Inho smiled and said, "That person is shrewd, scheming, and ruthless, making him incredibly difficult to deal with. All of you have seen how miserable things are in Verdant Bamboo Lake now, so let me say these unpleasant things first. I'm simply giving you a space to meet and discuss matters, so please don't go for wool and come back shorn. If he still has enough strength and chases you to my dragon palace, then your 2 immortal forces can easily run, but I'll definitely be done for at that time." He Lu used the bamboo flute in his hand to lightly tap his palm as he proposed, "How about we kill you if we truly want to gauge this person's strength? This is not only simple but also very effective. After we kill you, we can toss his corpse outside Imperial Accompanying City, and our 2 immortal forces can temporarily set aside our differences and work closely together to set up an immortal formation beforehand. That way, we'll only need to sit back and watch him charge headfirst into the trap." Fan Weiran smacked the table in front of her and exclaimed through loud laughter, "Young lad, you've never appeared more pleasing to the eye than right now. We'll go with your plan." She then shifted her gaze and asked, "What do you say, City Lord Yi?" Yihan smiled faintly and nodded in response. Yanqing's gaze was lowered, with her eyelashes trembling slightly. That night, everyone inside the Dragon Palace at the bottom of Verdant Bamboo Lake exchanged baffled looks as they heard the latest news. He Lu's expression was extremely dark. Lake Lord Inho couldn't bring himself to laugh anymore. He was worried about whether his current role as a peacemaker between the 2 immortal forces would end in disaster, and he prayed that he wouldn't follow in the footsteps of those canal masters and river gods who were almost all dead. He didn't want his dragon palace to be destroyed by a single sword strike as well. Severe wounds take 100 days to heal, and this is the case for ordinary mortal humans. That being the case, things will only be more troublesome for cultivators like us. Since the sword cultivator has suffered extremely severe wounds, how about we compose ourselves and plan things slowly and carefully? Yihan suggested in a quiet voice. Die. It was the end of the year already, yet there was no atmosphere of joy or celebration in Imperial Accompanying City. People were gloomy and in low spirits as they visited friends and family, complaining and grumbling about the terrible situation that they were in. And thus, those who hadn't felt especially frustrated and resentful to begin with started to feel increasingly resentful as well. Over at the ghost residence, some unfamiliar faces dressed like ordinary residents of the city gradually started to appear. Afterward, more and more of these people arrived in the city and gathered near the ghost residence. As time went on, legitimate residents of the city started to gather around the ghost residence as well, pointing at it and talking quietly among themselves. When one child threw rocks at the ghost residence and angrily shouted curses at it, it was as if the floodgates were finally blasted open. There were spirited discussions among the residents of the city, with most people complaining and dissatisfaction. In the end, people started to feel a sincere sense of resentment and anger at the situation. They complained about the sword immortal, questioning why he had allowed so much wealth and infrastructure of the city to be destroyed since he was such a powerful person. Diyu almost exploded in anger as he stood near the courtyard wall and listened to the people's abuse. He strode over to the mighty senior's side and plunked down on a small stool, clenching his hands into fists as he said in an aggrieved voice, "Senior, if this continues, then people will even start to throw feces at the courtyard wall, to say nothing of rocks. Do you truly not want me to go outside to deal with the situation?" The young man in white was lying on a bamboo chair, lightly rocking his bamboo fan back and forth as he asked with a faint smile, "What day is it today?" As for the long sword in the scabbard, Qian Ping'an had casually tossed it beside the bamboo chair. This mighty senior was truly very relaxed, and he had personally crafted this bamboo chair after chopping some fresh bamboo from the bamboo garden. Moreover, after interacting with Qian Ping'an for an extended period of time, he had a nagging feeling that this mighty senior was somehow different from before, although it couldn't be said that he was completely different from the very beginning. After hearing Qian Ping'an's question, Diyu faltered for a moment before counting on his fingers and replying, "Senior, today's the 2nd of the 2nd. Qian Ping'an suddenly sat up, snapping his folding fan closed as he stood up and remarked with a faint smile and squinted eyes, "Today's a good day." Diyu's mind felt numb at this moment, and he forcefully mustered his final sliver of courage. However, doing so was like a mortal human climbing a mountain, with things becoming increasingly difficult near the end. "Senior, this side of you makes me a little scared," he said in a timid voice. Holding the jade bamboo folding fan that Cui Dongshan had gifted him, Qian Ping'an moved 2 fingers slightly and caused the fan to snap open a small amount and then snap closed again. Doing this again and again, there was a crisp cracking sound as he smiled and replied, "You saved my life recently, so what is there for you to be afraid of? Shouldn't you be thinking about how you're going to be rewarded? Why are you worried about me punishing you instead? I already decided not to punish you for your crappy deeds in the cultivation world, while we were still at the water immortal shrine of Peony Stream." Qian Ping'an was wearing the golden sweet wine Dao robe that he already hadn't worn for many years, and this was because the spring grass Dao robe had been completely destroyed by the heavenly tribulation just then. To put it simply, Qian Ping'an wouldn't be able to fully repair the spring grass Dao robe, no matter how many immortal coins he poured into it. As such, he placed it inside his minimization treasure alongside his broken straw sandals and his empty wine pots. Just how intense and dangerous had the battle against the heavenly tribulation been? The answer to this was very simple. Qian Ping'an hadn't even had the time to put on his golden sweet wine Dao robe, even though this was something that could have been achieved in an instant with a single thought. Because of this, he could only rely on his physical body to forcefully withstand the punishment from the heavenly tribulation. Doing so was perhaps equivalent to bathing in the small thunder pool in accumulating Cloud Mountain for several days and several nights? Diyu gritted his teeth and asked with an aggrieved expression, "Senior, you're not heading out to massacre all of the ungrateful people in Imperial accompanying city, are you?" Qian Ping'an shot a sideways glance at Diyu and retorted, "Are you stupid or have I gone crazy? Why would I have blocked the heavenly tribulation if I'm going to massacre the city afterward?" Diyu wiped away the sweat on his forehead and replied in relief, "That's good then. Please don't hold a grudge against those ignorant commoners, Senior. It's not worth it." He was truly afraid of troubles arising one after another without pause. At that time it wouldn't just be him who was dragged into the mess and killed, but his parents and the entire Ghost Axe Palace would definitely be implicated as well. After parting ways at the water goddess shrine of Algae Stream before, Fan Weiran would have at most vented some anger at him. However, it was truly difficult to say how she felt now, and perhaps even Yellow Axe City's Yihan had his eyes on him as well. There were some matters that Diyu had seldom thought about in the past, but now that he had experienced so many brushes with death, he couldn't help but mull over these matters again and again. This was especially the case over the past few days, when he had stayed in the ghost residence and helped the mighty senior clean the buildings and the courtyards. He had carried buckets of water around and wiped the floor with pieces of cloth, engaging in crude and lowly housework that he had never once done before in his life. It was as if he were living a completely different life from before. Qian Ping'an placed the folding fan beside his waist, with his gaze jumping over the courtyard wall as he said, "Doing good or doing evil are private matters for them, so there's nothing for me to be disappointed about. Noble people act benevolently without seeking anything in return, and Senior truly embodies this lofty spirit." Diyu exclaimed with an earnest nod. Qian Ping'an smiled and said, "Oh, you can piss off and give it a rest with these obsequious words of praise in the future. Your skills are lacking in this area, and it seems to be a challenge for you to utter good-sounding praise. It sounds grating to the ear, and I've already been putting up with it for a very long time." There was an awkward smile on Duyu's face. Qian Ping'an grabbed his sword nurturing gourd and placed it on the bamboo chair, stepping on sword immortal using the tip of his toe, and causing it to lightly bounce up into his hand. He then said to Du Yu, "You can stay here. I need to head out for a bit." Du Yu naturally didn't dare to question the decision of this mighty senior, so he asked in a careful voice, "When is senior going to return?" "I'm going to the prefectural office, which is only a few steps away, and I'll pay a visit to Verdant Bamboo Lake or Black Glaze Mountain after that. It shouldn't take too long," Qian Ping'an replied with a smile. Du Yu breathed a sigh of relief. Qian Ping'an walked out of the ghost residence. Du Yu faced the vermilion wine gourd and held his palms together in a prayer, bowing down and praying, "Please protect this lowly subordinate, Lord Wine Gourd." When the immortal in white truly opened the gates and stepped out from the ghost residence, the 100 or so residents of Imperial accompanying city who had initially been causing a scene and shouting abuse immediately scattered and fled, regardless of whether they were old or young, men or women. Among the troublemaking residents were many people from wealthy families who felt like they had suffered undeserved calamity and incurred heavy financial and material losses. There were many servants and stewards from these wealthy families, having been sent over by their masters to demand compensation for their losses. There were also hooligans who had rushed over from all corners of Imperial accompanying city to get in on the action, and quite a number of righteous youths who had gathered here hoping to catch a glimpse of the sword immortal as well. Everyone said that this outsider sword immortal was extremely wealthy, had a very good temper, and was severely wounded right now, forcing him to recuperate in Imperial accompanying city for a long time. The latter claim was proven by the fact that he had already hidden inside the ghost residence for a long time without daring to show himself. However, who knew whether he would randomly catch someone from the street and refuse to let them go after he stepped out from the ghost residence? He was a mighty sword immortal, after all, and a starving camel was still bigger than a horse. As such, they still needed to be careful. There was coincidentally a group of young men charging over with a cart of feces, roaring with laughter and feeling extremely proud about their bold and impressive actions. They greatly enjoyed the thumbs up and the loud cheers from people in the surroundings, and this caused them to push the cart of feces with even more excitement and vigor. They were only 20 to 30 paces away from the eerie ghost residence that no normal person dared to live in. Yet it was at this moment that the immortal in white coincidentally stepped out from the door and directly looked over at them. The three young men who always wandered around Imperial accompanying city without doing anything useful instantly froze to the spot, unable to move their legs anymore. However, there was a person who slowly walked out from a street corner, dressed in mourning clothes as she walked over against the flow of fleeing people. She was a fairly good-looking young woman, and she was carrying a very young infant in her arms, with the baby still swaddled in blankets. The spring chill was biting cold, however, so it was difficult to tell whether the baby was sleeping or sick as it lay silently in the young woman's arms. There was a grief-stricken look on the young woman's face as she briskly walked over, and she surprisingly overtook the cart of feces and the three young men before dropping to her knees and looking up at the young immortal in white, saying through uncontrollable sobs, "Esteemed immortal, my husband was killed by the collapsing roof, so how can a young mother like me survive by myself? I beg you, esteemed immortal, please save me and my child." The young woman wailed in a hysterical manner, crying so hard that she was seemingly about to faint at any moment. The residents hiding further down the streets and alleys started to point and murmur, with someone quietly saying that this young woman was seemingly a resident from Sprouting Alley. She had indeed gotten married at the beginning of last year. She was truly a pitiful person. Qian Ping'an squatted down and asked, "The weather is so cold, so as a mother, are you truly willing to subject your young child to harsh conditions like this? Should you not have asked your neighbors to look after your child while you came here to wail about injustice? On second thought, you're almost about to die, so why would you still care about these matters, right?" The young woman faltered upon hearing this, completely caught off guard by the young sword immortal's incisive words. There was a stupefied look on her face. Qian Ping'an smiled faintly and remarked, "You seem to be quite unfamiliar with how to carry a child. Is this perhaps your first child?" The young woman started to wail in anguish, refusing to say anything else. Qian Ping'an held his hands inside his opposite sleeves and said slowly, "Hang on a moment. If I decide to ignore you and walk away, will you raise this child above your head and tell me that you'll decide to die if I don't save you, since you'll eventually end up dying anyway?" And rather than forcing this child to suffer for the rest of their life, you might as well throw them to the ground and kill them right here and now, allowing them to reincarnate into a better family? Then you'll say that it was you and your husband's fault for coming across such a heartless immortal, after which you'll bang your head against a wall and commit suicide as well. And that way the three of you can reunite underground? Or have I perhaps said more than those people taught you already? The young woman didn't say anything, simply continuing to wail in a grief-stricken manner, one which caused the bystanders to also shed tears in grief. Chen Ping'an glanced at the man in the distance who had revealed the young woman's identity, smiling faintly as he did so. The man's expression changed slightly, and he immediately retreated into a small alley and left as quickly as he could. There was the hurriedly fleeing man, the young woman wailing on her knees in front of Chen Ping'an, and the assassin from the cultivation world hiding inside the cart of feces. Even the people coming up with these minor schemes most likely hadn't thought that they would succeed. That being the case, were they simply doing this to repulse Chen Ping'an? Chen Ping'an found this quite interesting. Lake Lord Ho definitely didn't have the courage to do this right now, while the treasure basin Immortal Realms Fan Weiran wasn't scheming enough to do something in such a roundabout manner. Perhaps it was City Lord Yihan of Yellow Axe City, whom he had never seen before? Or perhaps it was the young man called He Lu performing these deeds through some petty officials, who were subordinate to a higher-ranking official in Imperial accompanying city. In any case, the three martial artists, the young woman, and the Qi refiner might still be unaware of the true mastermind behind everything even as they charged headfirst to their deaths. Of course, they naturally had their own reasons and plans to seek death by coming here. What should Chen Ping'an do? He indeed felt repulsed by the lowly schemes of these immortal forces. There was a blur in front of the young woman's eyes. The young immortal in white surprisingly disappeared without warning. The young woman gritted her teeth and stood up, and sure enough, she raised the swaddled baby high into the air and was just about to slam it to the ground. Before doing this, however, she looked toward the alley and cried hysterically, "This sword immortal is a heartless person who caused my husband to die. Yet this sense of guilt doesn't weigh on his conscience at all. Today, both my child and I are going to die as well, and our family of three won't forgive this sword immortal even after we become ghosts." The young woman ruthlessly threw the child to the ground, praying that she could kill it in a single go. Otherwise, things would become extremely troublesome for her. That being the case, she summoned all her strength as she threw the child. Her future life of riches and glory all depended on this critical moment. The child wasn't hers anyway, and heavens knew where that unfamiliar man had found him from. As for her husband, who had died not long ago, he had died suddenly and without any notice. In any case, she had truly been blind to marry someone like him, someone who couldn't control his third leg or his hands. He was a gambling addict and a lecherous individual, and all of their money had been gambled away by him, causing her to suffer every single day. That being the case, it was actually a blessing in disguise that he had died so soon. After she killed the child, she needed to ram her head against a wall as well. However, she didn't need to actually kill herself, and she simply needed to cause a bloody wound and play dead afterward. She had already received a large pouch of gold coins beforehand, and she would receive another pouch of gold coins after she successfully completed her task. At that time, she could marry some random man and enjoy a life of comfort and riches. That wouldn't be difficult, would it? The young woman felt a slight sense of mental exhaustion after ruthlessly throwing the child to the ground, causing her to limply collapse to the ground. She then suddenly widened her eyes in shock. The sword immortal in white had suddenly appeared in front of her and squatted down at some unknown time, using his hand to catch the swaddled child. Chen Ping'an stood up with the child in his arms, moving gently as he used a finger to push aside a corner of the blanket and lightly touched the child's hand. Fortunately, the child was only a little stiff from the cold and nothing more. Indeed, the perpetrators had most likely felt like there was no need to do anything else to this child who was going to die very soon. Sure enough, this was the limit of those cultivators' mental capacity. It wasn't easy to be a good person, but was it also this difficult to be a bad person who was completely rotten to the core? Chen Ping'an pursed his lips, but his gaze immediately became soft and gentle when he looked at the child in his lap. He deftly tightened the blankets around the child, not forgetting to release a controlled amount of heat from his palm as he did so, helping the child resist the bone-chilling cold. No child in the world deserved to suffer hardship and calamity so early in their life. Qian Ping'an tapped his foot and dashed backward, appearing like a ray of white light as he returned inside the ghost residence. You most probably still felt nervous, but he naturally didn't dare to sit on the bamboo chair where the sword nurturing gourd was resting. As such, he moved his small stool closer to the bamboo chair before quietly sitting there without moving. Of course, he didn't forget to wear his divine dew-bearing armor. You looked at the mighty senior who had already returned, and what he saw was a swaddled infant in his arms? What was the mighty senior doing? When going for a walk at night before, the mighty senior had said that he had been fortunate enough to find Diyu's divine dew-bearing armor and refined demon core. Even then, Diyu had still been able to go against his conscience and say that he believed the mighty senior. However, to pick up a swaddled child after heading out for a very short period of time? Diyu was genuinely dumbfounded. Qian Ping'an carefully handed the child to Diyu, with the latter appearing like he had been struck by lightning as he dazedly extended his arms to accept the child. Qian Ping'an furrowed his brows and scolded, "Retract your divine dew-bearing armor." Diyu was given a fright, and he hurriedly retracted his armor and placed the refined demon core that he was tightly clutching in his palm back inside his sleeve. He then rigidly accepted the swaddled child, feeling extremely awkward as he did so. Diyu almost wanted to cry when he saw the mighty senior's expression of disgust, thinking to himself, "Senior, I'm still young and have little experience in the cultivation world, so I'm truly nowhere near as deeply knowledgeable and capable as you." "I'll return soon," Qian Ping'an said. He then stressed, "This child is young and has caught a slight cold, so pay more attention to his breathing and be very sure to control your spiritual energy when you use it to keep him warm. If there's any problem with his health, then remember to grab the sword nurturing gourd when you leave the ghost residence to look for an experienced doctor." Diyu nodded earnestly in response. Qian Ping'an pondered for a moment before flicking his wrist and retrieving his last remaining walnut, explaining, "When you throw this walnut, its explosive might will be equivalent to the full power strike of an earth immortal. There's no need to recite a mantra or whatnot, and any chi refiner will be able to use this item. Even lower 5-tier cultivators with their fragile physiques will only cough up a few mouthfuls of blood and exhaust all of their accumulated spiritual energy after using this item. They won't suffer any significant side effects. In any case, you're already at the peak stage of the cave abode tier, and you're also a militarian cultivator in addition to that. That being the case, you can feel free to use this item if you encounter any danger." Diyu was still carrying the child, so he could only turn to his side and bend down, extending his hand slightly to accept the incredibly valuable immortal treasure. He immediately felt much more confident and at ease. It was rare for the mighty senior to be so talkative and nagging. For some unknown reason, however, the mighty senior appeared slightly more familiar at this moment. Qian Ping'an took a deep breath and no longer held sword immortal in his hand, once again placing it on his back as he murmured, "You people have become addicted to scheming and causing trouble, have you?" Diyu sighed in grief. The familiar feeling was gone again. He silently told himself that the mighty senior was going to great pains to help him. Diyu temper his mental state. The mighty senior had already vanished without a trace. There was no rippling spiritual energy, nor was there any gust of wind. It was as if he had fused together with heaven and earth. Diyu gently rocked the child in his arms back and forth, but he didn't dare to move too quickly lest he accidentally wake the child up. Fucking hell. He had never even shown such gentleness and care to those gallant women in the cultivation world before. Diyu looked down and remarked with emotion, "Little baby, your fortune is as lofty as the heavens." In a narrow and deserted alley with no one else, a man leaned against the wall and gulped in apprehension. It appeared like the young sword immortal in white hadn't chased after him. It was truly challenging to earn that single lesser heat coin. Even though the official immortal who had been his point of contact hadn't appeared like someone who could produce a lesser heat coin, immortal coins weren't something that could be forged. In any case, he would have been killed if he hadn't accepted this task, so he had been left with no option but to obediently do as he was told. He had found a petty official in Imperial accompanying city, and similar to how he had been bribed and threatened, he had also offered a pouch of silver coins to the petty official and threatened him with death if he didn't accept the task. The petty official wasn't stupid. So he had helped the man find the deplorable couple in Sprouting Alley. It was thanks to this that the young woman had been able to cause a commotion in front of the ghost residence just then. The vagrant cultivator retrieved the lesser heat coin and smiled widely, murmuring that the official immortal was truly someone who didn't treat money like money. He wished that he could partake in such a transaction again. You're quite impressive as well, not treating human lives like lives, someone chuckled beside his ear. The vagrant cultivator rigidly turned his head around, only to see the otherworldly immortal in white standing several paces away and rocking his folding fan back and forth. He hadn't detected the sword immortal's presence at all. The vagrant cultivator's voice was quivering as he replied, "No, I'm not impressive at all, great sword immortal. I was forced to do this and I had no option but to comply. The official immortal from Blissful Dream Peak, who instructed me to do this, simply didn't want to dirty his own hands with this kind of matter. In reality, he's even more of a vagrant cultivator than me, and he's even more dismissive of the lives of ordinary mortal humans." He forced a smile and continued, "Great sword immortal, you might not know this, but the young woman from Sprouting Alley has a truly sinister mind, with her late husband being even more detestable and deserving of death. Thankfully, this mortal couple had poor cultivation aptitude and could only roll around in the muddy mortal world, or else they would have truly been impressive in their sinister ways if they had embarked on the path of cultivation." Chen Ping'an smiled faintly and commented, "I'm not asking about your thoughts and I'm simply observing your actions. Otherwise, how many people in the world can get away? What do you say?" The vagrant cultivator nodded earnestly and replied, "Yes, yes, yes, great sword immortal is correct." After saying this, he heard the outsider sword immortal, who was surprisingly able to block a heavenly tribulation and survive, ask in a slightly astonished voice. A measly official immortal from Blissful Dream Peak felt like it would dirty his hands to kill a few mortal humans, so with me being a sword immortal, would I be dirtying my hands if I wanted to kill you? Otherwise, why didn't I kill the money-chasing young women, the 3 hooligans pushing the cart of feces around, or the assassin hiding in the cart of feces and eating shit?" The vagrant cultivator bowed deeply and held up the lesser heat coin with both hands, smiling obsequiously and replying, "Since great sword immortal thinks that killing us will dirty your hands, then why don't you act benevolently and spare me this time? I don't want to dirty great sword immortal's divine weapon, and a foul-smelling insect like me isn't worthy of great sword immortal's blade anyway. There are a myriad of immortal techniques, so do I need to draw my sword to deal with you?" Chen Ping'an asked. The vagrant cultivator immediately became drenched in sweat when he heard this, not daring to utter another word. "You're only feeling afraid now that I'm acting the same sinister way as you people?" Chen Ping'an mused. He lightly tapped his head with his folding fan, appearing relaxed and lazy as he chuckled in a soft voice. "To fall silent in front of evildoers, and to stab the backs of well-intentioned people. You people are quiet and taciturn at times, yet you people also speak with vigor and a barbed tongue at other times. How very strange, how very mystical." It wasn't that the vagrant cultivator didn't want to flee, but his hands and feet were completely ignoring his commands at this moment. "Go on, I give you permission to shout at the top of your lungs and alert everyone in the city that the sword immortal is about to ruthlessly kill someone. I can spare your life if you manage to successfully alert the entire city," Chen Ping'an said. The vagrant cultivator furiously shook his head, mustering his courage and saying in a sobbing voice, "I wouldn't dare to. This lowly person wouldn't dare to carelessly smear great sword immortal like this." The sword immortal replied with an "oh," and remarked that he was in for some suffering then. Before the vagrant cultivator could say anything, Chen Ping'an lightly smacked the man's head with his folding fan, after which he casually flicked his sleeve and captured the man's 3 immortal souls and 7 mortal forms, using his astral energy to slowly grind them down. If all of the good people in the world comforted themselves and eased their pain by thinking that there would naturally be sinister people to punish other sinister people, then the world genuinely wouldn't be a very good place. As for the lesser heat coin, Chen Ping'an allowed it to fall beside the corpse just like that. In the end, the immortal coin rolled into a crack in the alleyway. A young man in white slowly walked out of the alley. A short moment later, a ray of golden sword light surged up from the ground as the immortal in white left Imperial accompanying city on his sword, and directly flew toward Verdant Bamboo Lake. A dark green flying sword dashed out from the ghost residence, and followed after the ray of golden sword light. Die. Inside the Imperial Preceptor's office in the capital of the blissful Dream Nation, two powerful cultivators sat opposite each other, with a small turquoise lake between them. There was an old scholar with white hair and dressed in azure robes who appeared like he had never served as an official before, and a young man still in his 20s. There was a small monkey barely alive lying on the old scholar's knees, and a small azure snake that was seemingly asleep located on the young man's waist. There were already horns poking out from the azure snake's head, and its head and tail were connected at this moment as if it were an azure belt around the young man's waist. Standing far behind the old scholar in Confucian robes was a deathly pale woman. This fox spirit's appearance was ordinary, yet her eyes were incredibly seductive. Even though she was standing behind her master with a small lake between her and the young man, she still couldn't help but tremble with fear and unease. After all, the might and renown of this so-called young man were far too terrifying. His name was Xiaozhan, and he had once been a vagrant cultivator who had controlled a vast mountain all by himself. He had never taken any direct disciples, and had only raised some servants and children with passable aptitude. Afterward, he had given the mountain with abundant spiritual energy and incredible feng shui away, only relocating his immortal abode using a profound mystical ability. Afterward, he had vanished from the southeastern region of the northern complete reed continent, with no one ever hearing about him again. It was this powerful immortal who had made a secret deal with her master. However, the fox spirit knew that her master had paid a huge price back then, exhausting a significant amount of his vital energy to unleash a profound ability and suppress that elusive and peculiar treasure of virtue, eventually managing to obtain it. Meanwhile, Xiaozhan had become an ally with his master, and through gifting his vast mountain to two powerful neighboring immortal forces in exchange, he had been able to obtain the dozen or so nations, which were relatively barren and had always lacked spiritual energy, as his exclusive property. This was similar to the small lake in front of Xiaozhan right now. Both sides were taking what they needed and planning for the long term. However, the fox spirit hadn't imagined that her master, who should have been cultivating in seclusion outside the dozen or so nations, would suddenly disguise himself and transform into a locally born imperial preceptor of the blissful Dream Nation. Having read the intelligence reports from the Silver Screen Nation many years ago, she was naturally familiar with the state of affairs in the blissful Dream Nation. Her master had most likely started off as a so-called child prodigy in an impoverished clan in the blissful Dream Nation, after which he had participated in the imperial examination and become a champion scholar, bringing glory to his clan. After entering the officialdom, it was as if he had been assisted by the heavens, not only showing remarkable talent in terms of writing essays and composing poems, but also showing a strong ability to govern. In the end, he had become the youngest prime minister in the history of the blissful Dream Nation, reaching this lofty position in just his 40s. However, he had suddenly resigned and disappeared from public view, with rumors claiming that he had hung up his official seal after encountering an immortal who had taught him cultivation techniques. At the time, countless people's umbrellas had been sincerely crafted to commemorate his service and bid him farewell. After entering the mountain forests, he had refined alchemical pills and cultivated in seclusion, mastering the immortal techniques that he had been taught in just a measly 10 years. The fox spirit had initially viewed this as a joke, thinking that her master was simply toying around with the common people. Auspicious scenes had continuously appeared in the capital of the blissful Dream Nation and in the surrounding cities, and the new emperor who had just ascended the throne had personally visited the immortal mountain to invite the former prime minister back to the capital of the nation, appointing him as the new imperial preceptor. The nation had been peaceful and prosperous while he had served as an official, and it had experienced good weather and bountiful harvests after he became an immortal. It was as if the blissful Dream Nation had become an otherworldly paradise thanks to this person's incredible abilities. There had been no shortage of scholarly talents and martial talents in the imperial court, and the officials in the regions had also been amicable and cooperative with each other. Thanks to his support, both the former emperor and the new emperor had been able to strive for further prosperity without ever provoking the neighboring nations. When being pursued by the horde of cultivators in imperial accompanying city, the fox spirit had lost 2 of her tails and suffered wounds to the foundation of her great Tao. After her master appeared, however, He simply brought her and her colleague to this imperial preceptor's office in the capital of the blissful dream nation, and he was still yet to reward them for successfully obtaining the valuable treasure. This caused the fox spirit to wallow in self-pity. She had lost her fame and glory as the empress of the Silver Screen Nation, and she was surprisingly feeling unaccustomed now that she had returned to her original position as a measly maidservant of her master. Xiaozhan smiled faintly and said, "Congratulations on achieving your objective, fellow cultivator. It's only a matter of time before you can establish your own sect. I'll naturally retract the remaining restrictions from that golden thunder pool, and allow the spiritual energy outside to slowly flow toward the dozen or so nations." The old man in Confucian robes replied in a calm and indifferent voice. "After 100 years, countless cultivation prodigies will appear in this region. As for He Lu, Yanqing, and the others, they're still very young, so they can reap the benefits of this change before everyone else and easily become golden core tier cultivators. If fellow cultivator is able to nurture 7 or 8 golden core tier earth immortals at the same time, then this will also set a strong foundation for you to establish your own sect. So, congratulations to you as well." There was a sincere look in Xiaozhan's eyes as he remarked with emotion, "Compared to fellow cultivator's strategies and abilities, I have to concede that I'm inferior. Fellow cultivator was genuinely able to obtain that treasure of virtue, and the treasure was actually an innate sword pellet as well. Truth be told, I initially thought that there was a greater than 60% chance that fellow cultivator's gamble would yield no results." Xiaozhan felt extremely impressed as he glanced at the glowing abdomen of the small monkey. This old cultivator, who had almost been on the verge of falling to the golden core tier, had unexpectedly managed to conceal his identity and escape from the various forces that had been coveting his treasures and baying for his blood. Afterward, the old cultivator had acted in a shockingly bold manner and hid right under his nose, eventually using his accumulated virtue from benefiting a nation to righteously obtain the valuable treasure of virtue. This plot of his was truly befitting his status as a nascent tier cultivator. The old cultivator smiled and replied, "Fellow cultivator, you also made a bold and courageous move, willingly giving up a feng shui treasure land in exchange for a dozen or so nations that no one fancied at all. If managed properly, fellow cultivator can definitely break even after 100 years and enjoy bountiful yields for 1,000 years. One person sought valuable treasures, while the other person sought impressive talents. With these goals in mind, the two powerful nascent tier cultivators had joined forces to orchestrate their grand schemes. The final result was success and satisfaction for both parties. However, both of them were well aware that things would become unpredictable again once either one of them advanced to the upper 5 tiers first. After establishing a sect, it was natural for people to desire expansion of their territory. When the old man retracted the thunder pool and allowed spiritual energy to funnel into the dozen or so nations, would Xiaozhan stand by and look on as the abundant spiritual energy freely flowed into his territory and was wasted on the measly ants who had pathetically skirmished with each other for so many years? As for Fan Weiran and Yi Han leading their trash disciples and failing to snatch the valuable treasure from the fox spirit and the elderly cultivator, Xiaozhan genuinely didn't feel very disappointed or frustrated about this. After all, the abundant spiritual energy was the foundation of his great Tao, so he shouldn't become too greedy and covet the other treasures as well. In any case, the nascent tier alliance between him and the old man in Confucian robes hadn't been a perfunctory deal, and it was understandably impossible for someone to obtain all of the benefits in the world. Since the current situation was favorable and stable, Xiaozhan would focus on voraciously absorbing the abundant spiritual energy, while the old man in Confucian robes focused on refining his treasure of virtue and embarked on the dangerous journey of changing paths to become a sword cultivator. Xiaozhan also had a chance to overcome the numerous barriers and rapidly advance to the upper 5 tiers. It was necessary to have some small smarts, but one couldn't rely on these small smarts to feed themselves forever. Earth immortals needed to develop the vision and mindset befitting of Earth immortals. As if remembering something, Xiaozhan said, "I visited Imperial Accompanying City after the descent of the heavenly tribulation, and I discovered something that was a very big surprise to me." "Please go on, fellow cultivator," the old man in Confucian robes said with a smile. Xiaozhan rested his hands on his azure belt and continued with a faint smile. "If my eyes didn't deceive me, then the sword on that outsider sword immortal's back was a pseudo-celestial tool, I'm decently capable when it comes to doing battle, but it's a shame that I'm extremely mediocre when it comes to refining treasures. However, fellow cultivator is coincidentally skilled at refining treasures, so how about we sign another contract and become allies again? A brilliant gleam appeared in the old man's eyes, yet this gleam disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. He was completely uninterested in immortal treasures, as the innate sword pellet that contained abundant virtue was going to be his foundation to become an upper 5-tier cultivator in the future. As such, he didn't want to delay its refinement by a single day. But a pseudo-celestial tool? However, the old man in Confucian robes quickly resisted the temptation. Was Xiazhen his father or his son? Was Xiazhen perhaps telling him about this rare treasure out of the goodness of his heart? With this in mind, the old nascent-tier cultivator who was temporarily the imperial preceptor of the blissful dream nation shook his hand and said with loud laughter, "Fellow cultivator can take the treasure if you please." Indeed, fellow cultivator deserves to obtain this fated opportunity. As for me, forget about it. There are many taboos for me to navigate regarding my movements before I manage to successfully refine this valuable treasure, and I'm sure that fellow cultivator is well aware of these extremely troublesome matters as well. With fellow cultivator's cultivation base, killing a young and wounded sword cultivator definitely won't be too difficult. So let me wish fellow cultivator good luck and success in obtaining a pseudo-celestial tool. Xiazhen smiled and nodded in response, not surprised at all about the old man's cautious nature. They were both nascent-tier vagrant cultivators, so they couldn't have survived until today if they took bait so easily. After doing many shady things over the years, killing people and stealing treasures, however, they still needed to be wary of other powerful cultivators. Xiazhen had committed this principle to memory ever since a young age, and it was still fresh in his mind even after countless years. This was the greatest wealth that his master, a 5th-tier vagrant cultivator who had died at his hands back then, had left him. Xiazhen had only been at the 2nd tier at the time, so how had he managed to overcome the deadly dangers to kill his master and snatch his treasures? This was because the master and his disciple had accidentally come across a huge obstacle. Thus, whenever Xiazhen found himself becoming smug and complacent in the many years afterward, he would bring up that old principle in his mind and silently recite it a few times. Xiazhen stood up and said with a smile, "There's no need to see me off, fellow cultivator." The old man in Confucian robes grabbed the small monkey with one hand and still stood up to see Xiazhen off anyway, saying, "Fellow cultivator can also feel at ease. I'll be leaving the blissful dream nation shortly." Xiazhen transformed into a ray of light and soared into the distance, instantly becoming a tiny speck as he shot through a patch of low-hanging clouds and leisurely flew away. The imperial preceptor of the blissful dream nation lightly shook the small monkey in his hand as he gazed up and chuckled. He was actually able to restrain himself and not attack. This is truly a difficult feat for Xiazhen. The fox spirit and the skinny elderly cultivator stood respectfully with their hands by their sides in the distance. "Master, are you truly going to ignore that pseudo-celestial tool?" the fox spirit asked. Even though Xiazhen won't benefit much from obtaining it, it's a completely different story for Master. The old man in Confucian robes used a mystical ability to imprison the small monkey in a small world inside his sleeve. He then turned around and replied, "I receive very limited news in this tiny blissful dream nation, and my current intelligence is far inferior to Xiazhen's. If you're so interested in that pseudo-celestial tool, then why don't you head over to obtain it for me?" The fox spirit didn't dare to say anything else, not even daring to breathe too loudly. Her true identity had already been exposed by City Lord Yihan of Yellow Axe City, so she was no longer the empress of the Silver Screen Nation or whatnot. If she returned to Imperial Accompanying City and revealed her presence, she would definitely become nothing more than a hunted rodent. The old man in Confucian robes smiled in ridicule and continued, "He's a sword cultivator who's willing to face the heavenly tribulation, and he's a young man who's willing to reveal his pseudo-celestial tool to other people. That being the case, will he be a measly pushover? If he is, then why didn't Xiazhen target him, instead running over to me and kindly revealing this huge secret? In any case, once a pseudo-celestial tool chooses its master, what violently tragic scene will take place once its master dies, and the pseudo-celestial tool loses control? The two of you are truly like frogs living at the bottom of the well, completely oblivious to the weight and dangers of these matters."